Han Li was rather surprised to see this, but his body immediately swayed, following which he abruptly appeared on the summit of the small mountain before tapping it with the tips of his toes. Gray light immediately began to surge around the small black mountain, and it swelled drastically to 3,000 feet in size. The elderly man had been able to just barely hoist up the small mountain in its former state, and his expression changed drastically in the face of this sudden development. His feet began to sink into the ground, and soon he had been buried up to his calves. This was an indication that the elderly man's strength alone wasn't enough to keep the mountain at bay, thereby forcing him to transfer some of the force into the ground beneath his feet. Han Li looked on expressionlessly as he stomped down onto the small mountain again. The divine essence-effused mountain was extraordinarily heavy to begin with, and with Han Li's assistance, the black mountain was able to crash down once again, completely crushing the elderly man beneath it amid a rumbling boom. However, Han Li only became warier upon seeing this. He was certainly not going to be deluded into thinking that a body integration stage being would be so easy to kill. Thus, he made a hand seal with one hand while his other pristine white palm pressed down toward the black mountain. Gray light flashed over the surface of the mountain, and it continued to expand at a dramatic rate. At the same time, a burst of 5 colored flames also surged forth from his fingers before spreading over the ground at the foot of the mountain. A layer of 5 colored ice was instantly formed, transforming the ground down below in a radius of several hundred feet into a frosty glacial land. At this point, the black mountain had already swelled to over 10,000 feet tall, making it comparable to a real mountain. Even so, Han Li still showed no signs of stopping. Spiritual light flashed from his body, and he shot forth toward one side as a streak of azure light before abruptly disappearing into thin air. Immediately thereafter, a burst of low buzzing suddenly rang out in the air around the Black Mountain. Series of small azure swords emerged, before transforming into palm-sized azure lotus flowers amid a flash of azure light. These lotus flowers rotated on the spot, and countless lotus flower projection surfaced around them before gradually taking on a more substantial form. All of a sudden, lotus flowers had concealed the entire sky, and they formed a massive barrier of light to completely ensnare the elderly man within. Han Li had taken advantage of this brilliant opportunity to activate his spring-dawn sword formation. Right at this moment, a roar of fury erupted from beneath the mountain, following which a string of incantation chants rang out. Wisps of crimson light suddenly surfaced in the surrounding air. In the beginning, there were only around a dozen or so of these wisps of light, but as the incantations were recited more quickly, more and more wisps of red light began to appear. Moments later, virtually the entire sky had been stained red by the crimson light. At the same time, the temperatures in the surrounding area became extraordinarily high, hot enough to instantly reduce a mortal into human jerky. At this moment, the incantation ceased, and the wisps of crimson light all surged into the layer of 5-colored ice on the ground in a flash. Immediately thereafter, rumbling booms akin to loud thunderclaps rang out from underground. Moments later, pillars of crimson light that were each as thick as a large bowl broke through the layer of ice. The pillars of light only flashed a few times, and the layer of ice rapidly melted into nothingness. The nearby ground was also instantly dissolved into a crimson liquid by the red light. In just the span of a few breaths, a vast stretch of ground had been transformed into a massive lava pit. The Black Mountain slowly descended into the bubbling lava, and it didn't take long for most of the mountain to be completely submerged. As expected, "It looks like this won't be enough to kill you." Han Li's indifferent voice abruptly rang out from all directions. Immediately thereafter, the Black Mountain shrank dramatically within the lava pit, reducing itself down to around a foot in size before surging back as a streak of white light. However, after it had traveled several tens of feet away from the lava, the elderly man's cold voice suddenly rang out. "I just so happen to be missing an ornamental treasure in my cave abode. This one's not bad." As soon as his voice trailed off, a massive wave of lava over 100 feet tall erupted from the lava pit down below. Immediately thereafter, red light flashed, and the lava transformed into a massive crimson hand that caught the small Black Mountain in its grasp. Red light flashed from the huge hand as it attempted to drag the mountain back into the lava. However, even though Han Li had already withdrawn most of the divine essence-effused mountain's power, its extraordinary weight was not something that could be easily moved by the massive hand. Thus, the Black Mountain managed to hold its position in midair, even as the giant lava hand continued to exert pulling force toward it. However, at the same time, it was unable to fly toward the nearby azure light barrier as Han Li had intended. At this moment, Han Li let loose a cold harumph, and spatial fluctuations erupted around the massive crimson hand, immediately following which countless azure threads appeared out of thin air. The azure threads flashed around the massive hand like lightning, instantly slicing its fingers into countless segments. Thus, the miniature black mountain was freed, and it flew away as a streak of azure light again before disappearing into the azure light barrier after just a few flashes. The azure threads also abruptly disappeared as if they had never even appeared in the first place. You certainly do have some tricks up your sleeve. No wonder you have the courage to face me in direct battle. The elderly man didn't seem to have been irked by this development, but his voice was quite heavy and grim. Almost at the exact same moment, the lava down below parted, and the elderly man slowly emerged from within. His body was flashing with red light, and he only stopped after rising up over 100 feet into the air. He wore a cautious look on his face as he swept his gaze around him. This is a sword formation. The elderly man's expression changed as he instantly identified the situation that he was in. However, in the instant that the elderly man revealed himself, the azure lotus flowers around him began to shimmer with brilliant light, following which countless lotus petals shot forth. As these flower petals flew through the air, they instantly transformed into azure blades of wind that surged toward the elderly man from all directions. The elderly man's expression darkened, and the red light emanating from his body abruptly swelled to form a crimson light barrier, then shielded himself within. A string of spluttering sounds rang out as the blades of wind disappeared into the red light like moths diving into a flame. However, in the next instant, they were all reduced to balls of fire that incinerated them into nothingness. This high-grade Jiao Kai beings, fire attribute cultivation arts, were clearly extremely powerful to be able to ignite and incinerate even attacks manifested from wind. However, seeing as the elderly man had already been trapped in his sword formation, that was certainly not going to be the extent of the attacks that Han Li had prepared for him. The instant that the blades of wind were proven to be ineffective, brilliant azure light flashed high up in the air above, following which a series of massive azure logs that were as thick as a water tank came crashing down from above. Upon closer inspection, one would discover that the logs were extremely dense and seemingly immensely heavy. However, the elderly man merely gave a cold chuckle as he swept a sleeve upward, sending the red light around his body hurtling toward the oncoming logs. After coming into contact with the red light, the massive azure logs were all quickly reduced to plumes of smoke and ashes. Save your energy, brat. If your sword formation were of some other attribute, perhaps you'd be able to cause some trouble for me, but pure wood attribute sword formations are completely ineffective against me. I can destroy this formation with ease. The elderly man suddenly let loose a loud cry as he abruptly made a hand seal. The red light around his body swayed, and pillars of crimson light suddenly shot forth in all directions, striking the azure light barrier in a flash. A scorching aura immediately permeated throughout the entire space that was enshrouded under the barrier of light. A triumphant look appeared on the elderly man's face. In his mind, his powerful fire attribute cultivation arts would be able to destroy this wood attribute sword formation with ease. After that, he could press his cultivation base advantage to kill this unexpectedly troublesome opponent. A string of dull thumps rang out, and just as the elderly man had expected, massive holes were punctured into the light barrier with ease. Just as the azure lotus flowers around him were about to dissipate, his surroundings suddenly blurred, and the azure lotus flowers abruptly disappeared along with the light barrier. In the next instant, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar place with massive trees that were several hundred feet tall all around him. An illusionary technique. Despite the elderly man's vast reserves of battle experience, he was truly astonished on this occasion. Illusionary techniques weren't all that uncommon in other formations and restrictions, but they were very rare in sword formations, which predominantly pursued maximal destructive power. At the very least, this was the first time that the elderly man had seen a sword formation with an accompanying illusionary technique. However, the elderly man quickly recomposed himself before making a hand seal, upon which red light flashed from his body, and a pillar of crimson flames rose directly up into the air. He then opened his mouth to expel a white talisman, and the talisman disappeared in a flash before forming a gust of white gale-force winds that disappeared into the pillar of flames. Having been fanned by the fierce winds, the pillar of fire that was only around 10 feet in thickness originally rapidly swelled to over 100 feet thick, creating a very formidable sight to behold. The elderly man was situated at the very center of the pillar of flames, and he suddenly sat down with his legs crossed. At the same time, red light flashed above his head, and a massive projection of a sinister-looking beast that was entirely covered in crimson scales appeared. In the instant that the projection appeared, all of the world's origin chi in the nearby area was drawn to the elderly man at once. Pea-sized balls of five-colored light began to surface from the mountains, forests, and plants within a radius of several tens of kilometers. All of them surged toward the sword formation in a frenzy, as if they had been summoned there by something. Countless specks of light came raining down from above, only to instantly kept out by the streaks of azure sword chi that erupted from the sword formation. These specks of light exploded as they clashed with the sword chi to form clouds of five-colored mist, but there were simply far too many specks of light to contend with. Within moments, the mist that resulted from the explosion of these specks of light had become as viscous as liquid, thereby significantly slowing down the streaks of sword chi and making them a lot more sluggish. Almost at the exact same moment, the elderly man unleashed a massive pillar of fire that also began to wreak havoc within the sword formation. The countless massive logs raining down from above were reduced to smoke and ashes without being able to offer up any resistance. These logs were only projections, but they had manifested from the pure wood attribute spiritual power within the flying swords. Regardless of whether these logs were real or not, there was no way that they'd be able to withstand such fierce fire attribute attacks. All of a sudden, the surroundings blurred around the elderly man, and he reappeared in the real world. Han Li was hidden within the sword formation, and his heart sank slightly upon seeing this. As expected of a body integration stage being, even when trapped within a sword formation, he was still able to draw upon so much of the world's origin chi to exert pressure on the sword formation. However, this was also due to the large disparity between their cultivation bases. Otherwise, if Han Li were also at the body integration stage, he would have been able to easily scatter the world's origin chi gathered toward the sword formation. After all, it was far easier to scattering the world's origin chi than to summon it. This was also why beings above the spatial tempering stage very rarely drew upon the world's origin chi to directly attack their opponents. Even if they were to attempt that, it would be quite an arduous process, and if the opponent were of a similar cultivation base, they could easily wrest control over some of the world's origin chi that had been summoned. Thus, the only scenarios during which the world's origin chi would be summoned during battle would be if someone wanted to unleash some kind of powerful ability, or they'd run out of magic power, thereby forcing them to explore alternative power sources. Under such circumstances, it would be best to have a helper who could unleash an ability or had mastered a certain cultivation art that could allow them to summon the world's origin chi. That would make the world's origin chi more difficult for others to plunder. However, this was, overall, an extremely inefficient and risky course of action to be taken during battle, and the elderly man was only able to do so with such reckless abandon due to the fact that Han Li's cultivation base was far inferior to his. Thus, Han Li was naturally quite frustrated by this development. However, Qing Yuanzi had been able to combat body integration stage beings at just the spatial tempering stage, so he'd naturally prepared a countermeasure against attacks from the world's origin chi. Han Li exhaled as he rapidly flicked his 10 fingers through the air, sending one incantation seal after surging into the sword formation in a frenzy. Due to the compression from the world's origin chi from the outside and the pillar flames from the inside, the azure light barrier was flashing erratically, and the streaks of sword chi that were embroiled within the dense five-colored mist also disappeared in unison. Immediately thereafter, the barrier of light swelled and shrank, following which the azure lotus flowers within suddenly spread their petals before rotating on the spot in a frenzy. One shimmering azure vortex after another surfaced on the light barrier in the blink of an eye. The viscous mist of the world's origin chi were sucked into these vortexes at a rapid rate, and around 1/10 of it was absorbed by the sword formation in the blink of an eye. Thus, the wavering sword formation instantly became very stable again. The elderly man within the sword formation was manipulating the pillar of flames to wreak havoc within the formation, and he naturally immediately sensed what was happening to the world's origin chi outside. His heart jolted with shock, having clearly not expected this sword formation to possess such a profound ability. If things were to continue like this, the world's origin chi that he'd gathered would only be working to fortify the sword formation. In a fit of shock and rage, the elderly man immediately let loose a loud cry, and the sword formation began to tremor as all of the world's origin chi gathered outside was dispersed by gusts of fierce winds amid a string of rumbling booms. Even so, with the world's origin chi that the sword formation had already absorbed, it had become far more robust and stable than before. Thus, the world's origin chi that he'd summoned had presented itself to his opponent on a silver platter. If word of this were to spread, he's become the laughing stock of all of his brethren. At the height of his fury, the elderly chuckled coldly as he laid a hand onto the top of his own head. Immediately thereafter, a streak of light shot forth from his head before forming a massive projection with a set of blurry facial features. Before Han Li had a chance to glean the true appearance of the projection, it surged toward the elderly man before disappearing into his body. The elderly man instantly threw his head back and let loose a long cry while his face took on a sinister and menacing appearance. His body also swelled to 60 to 70 feet tall, and the small red horn on his glabella had elongated to around half a foot in length, which crimson scales surfaced all over his body. In the blink of an eye, the elderly man had become a fearsome devilish creature. A sinister smile appeared on his face as he flipped both of his hands over at once. In one hand, a faint golden flag appeared, over which a cloud of fiery mist was swirling incessantly. Meanwhile, a strange blue pouch appeared in his other hand. Both of them were tossed into the air without any hesitation, following which the elderly man began to chant something in a language that was completely foreign to Han Li. The flag waved itself through the air, and bursts of faint golden flames erupted from it. At the same time, the pouch bulged before expelling a burst of blue winds. Simultaneously, the elderly man opened his mouth to blast forth a fiery cloud that was as crimson as blood. The three then combined with the pillar of flames that was wreaking havoc within the sword formation. Red, blue, and golden light intertwined in an instant before forming a three-colored pillar of light. An earth-shattering boom erupted within the sword formation, and Han Li knew that he couldn't stand by idly any longer. As such, he activated one powerful illusionary technique after another within the Spring Dawn sword formation. By everything that was manifested as part of those illusions were instantly destroyed by the three-colored pillar of light. The Spring Dawn sword formation was completely unable to withstand such an assault, and the azure light barrier immediately began to flash erratically once again. Han Li drew a sharp breath upon seeing this. Half of his astonishment naturally arose from the immense power of the three-colored pillar of light, but the other half could be attributed to the blue pouch that the elderly man had produced following his transformation. That treasure was extremely familiar to him. It seemed to be a spirit treasure known as the Chaotic Heavenly Pouch, and it was listed on the Chaotic Myriad Spirit Roll. This spirit treasure was only a mid-range treasure among those on the Chaotic Myriad Spirit Roll, but it possessed a few incredible abilities that other treasures didn't possess, thereby earning it quite a reputation. Many years ago, the treasure had once belonged to a powerful being from the human race. However, that human later perished under unforeseen circumstances, and the spirit treasure disappeared as a result. In order to recover the treasure, many high-grade cultivators had searched through the human and demon territories, all to no avail, so how had it ended up in the hands of a Jiao Kai being on the Thunder Continent? This treasure was most definitely bad news for Han Li, and his mind raced for a way to counteract it. All of a sudden, a slightly bewildered look appeared on his face. Letter 1D4 1F, letter 1D563, letter 1D556, letter 1D4 1E, letter 1D430, letter 1D556, letter 1D5F0, letter 1D428, letter 1D46. According to the legends, the Chaotic Heavenly Pouch definitely possessed far more powerful abilities than what was being displayed within the sword formation. Could it be that this was only a replica? Or perhaps he'd wrongly identified it when it was actually some other kind of similar treasure? Han Li was unable to verify which notion was correct, but this was not something that he could carefully ponder under his present circumstances. The sword formation was about to fall, and Han Li's eyes narrowed as a cold light flashed through them. The legends about Qing Yuanzi using this sword formation to combat body integration stage beings were most likely true, but this likely due to the fact that Qing Yuanzi had also mastered the final few layers of the Azure Essence sword art, thereby allowing him to unleash the full power of the sword formation. He also had a set of refined Azure Bamboo Cloudswarm sword, but the cultivation arts he was using weren't prepared for this sword formation, so he was unable to unleash the trump card abilities that the sword formation possessed. This was why the sword formation appeared to be so inept in the face of the elderly man's attacks. However, after absorbing so much of the world's origin chi, there seemed to be a type of powerful ability that Han Li could just barely unleash with the sword formation. Han Li's eyes flashed as a thought occurred to him. This ability was indeed very powerful, but regardless of whether it proved to be effective or not, the sword formation itself would most likely instantly crumble following the event. However, Han Li had no choice but to give it a try under such circumstances. If the ability did indeed prove to be ineffective, then he'd have to use his 12 awakening transformations to engage his opponent in battle. In a worst-case scenario, he still had several types of talismans and his gold-devouring beetles as trump cards. Thus, Han Li remained quite calm throughout this battle against this early body integration stage being. In the next instant, Han Li began to chant something, and an incredible scene ensued within the sword formation. The azure light barrier in the air above suddenly blurred, following which a vine-like plant emerged before plunging into the light barrier. When it first appeared, it was only several inches in size, but it grew at a rapid rate that was discernible to the naked eye, swelling to several tens of feet in length in mere moments. The vine then immediately began to flower and bear fruit, forming a small green gourd right before the elderly man's astonished eyes. The gourd was only around the size of a human hand and appeared to be completely mundane. However, in the next instant, the azure lotus flowers within the light barrier tremored in unison, and countless inch-long sword projections shot forth before disappearing into the gourd. Immediately thereafter, an azure sword insignia appeared on the surface of the gourd. The insignia was barely visible initially, but as vast amounts of five-colored light injected itself into the gourd along the vine, the insignia suddenly became extremely clear and began flashing with five-colored light. The elderly man didn't know what kind of ability this was, but he was naturally quite unsettled by the scenes unfolding before his eyes. Thus, he instantly made a grabbing motion toward the gourd, and the pillar of three-colored light within the sword formation transformed into a massive three-colored hand before flying toward the gourd with devastating might. If the gourd were indeed only an ordinary gourd, then the fearsome three-colored hand wouldn't even have to come into contact with it before the entire vine would be reduced to nothingness. Right in this instant, Han Li suddenly uttered the word slash in an indifferent manner from his vantage point in the air above. The gourd rotated on the spot as light surged around it, following which a sword of light that was around a foot in length shot forth in a flash. The sword was flashing erratically with five-colored spiritual light, and runes of different sizes were hovering around it. In the instant that the light sword was blasted forth, both the gourd and the vine dissipated into specks of spiritual light. Meanwhile, the light sword swelled to around 10 feet in size in the blink of an eye, then slashed soundlessly toward the oncoming three-colored hand, seemingly in a completely harmless manner. However, the three-colored hand was suddenly split in half without any premonition, then exploded amid a resounding boom. The giant sword then slowly changed directions and aimed itself at the elderly man, instantly drawing an alarmed expression onto his face. For some reason, a sense of peril welled up in the elderly man's spiritual sense at the sight of the seemingly ordinary five-colored light sword. He immediately opened his mouth to expel a shimmering red flying sword without any hesitation. The sword was around 3 feet in length, and it was as glittering and translucent as if it had been forged from crystal. The flying sword flashed through the air as a streak of azure light, hurtling directly toward that unsettling five-colored light sword. A cold harumph rang out in the air above, and the five-colored sword abruptly slashed through the air again. The streak of crimson light instantly shuddered before reverting back to its original form as a flying sword, then plummeting directly downward. The sword had shrunk down to only several inches in length, but a sizable chink had appeared on its blade. Even though it had been sliced in half by the light sword, it had clearly been severely damaged. In the instant that the flying sword was damaged, the elderly man's face paled slightly, indicating that he'd also sustained internal injuries as a result. However, after unleashing 2 attacks, the dazzling light emanating from the five-colored light sword had dimmed significantly, and many of the runes hovering around it had also vanished. A sinister look appeared on the elderly man's face. He let loose a long cry. The three-colored light that had just been sliced apart surged toward his body before forming a suit of antiquated three-colored armor. The suit of armor didn't appear to be of a wooden nor metallic material, and it covered his entire body from head to toe, leaving only a pair of holes for his eyes. From a distance, it appeared that he had transformed into an armored giant. Immediately thereafter, the elderly man raised both arms into the air, and three-colored light flashed as an antiquated giant sword appeared in his hand. The elderly man clenched both hands around the hilt of the sword before positioning it in front of his body, and an astonishing burst of baleful chi instantly erupted into the heavens. At the same time, the blue pouch and golden flag descended from above, revolving around the elderly as a streak of blue light and a streak of golden light, respectively. Han Li's eyelids twitched involuntarily as he looked on from his hiding spot within the light barrier. Only after borrowing the world's origin chi that had been absorbed by the sword formation was he able to just barely unleash that ability, which had been named as the origin chi sword gourd by Qing Yuanzi. The ability manifested a gourd and used the sword chi from the 72 azure bamboo cloudswarm swords as a seed, then drew upon the world's origin chi to nurture a devastatingly powerful origin chi sword. Letter 1D487, letter 1D493, letter 1D65A, letter 1D486, letter 1D500, letter 1D4E, letter 1D4EC, letter 1D664, letter 1D662. The ability was extremely powerful, but it also required an astonishing amount of the world's origin chi to be unleashed. The two slashes that had just been unleashed had already expended close to half of the world's origin chi that had been absorbed by the sword formation. However, if the elderly man were led to believe that this was the extent of the origin chi sword's powers, then he was in for a nasty surprise. The power unleashed by the origin chi sword was completely dependent on how much of the world's origin chi was injected into the attack. Han Li was preparing to exhaust all of its remaining world's origin chi in the next attack. With that in mind, a cold smile appeared on Han Li's face, and he abruptly made a hand seal to spur the sword formation into action. Spiritual light instantly flashed from the azure light barrier, and the azure lotus flowers rotated on the spot before transforming into pillars of light that surged toward the giant light sword up above. Azure light flashed all over the entire heavens, and the azure light barrier thinned rapidly before completely vanishing. In the blink of an eye, only the 72 small azure swords remained hovering in midair, and all of them had turned rather dull and lusterless. Without the sword formation as camouflage, Han Li had also appeared high up in the air above. After absorbing so much power, the light sword had swelled to around twice its original size, and the details of the sword had become far clearer than before. Even though it was still a 5-colored sword, the azure color was clearly far more pronounced than the other 4 colors. Slash. Han Li pointed a finger down at the elderly man as he issued a cold instruction. The giant light sword slowly rose up into the air before crashing down from above. The armored elderly man also let loose a loud cry at the same time, and he slashed his antiquated giant sword through the air in retaliation. A thin thread of crystalline light and the thick streak of 3-colored sword chi approached one another amid an ear-splitting screech, but everything abruptly fell silent in the instant that the two came into contact with one another. Immediately thereafter, the crystalline light flashed past the 3-colored sword chi, and the latter vanished following a dull thump. The elderly man immediately raised his giant sword to defend himself upon seeing this. A crisp clang rang out, and the elderly man remained completely motionless. However, in the next instant, a burst of azure light suddenly flashed from the giant sword, following which half of it silently crashed downward. After the giant sword had been sliced in half, the small golden flag appeared. The flag shuddered before radiating a ball of piercing golden light, then also plummeting from the sky above in 2 halves. Meanwhile, the chaotic heavenly pouch remained completely unscathed. The armor-clad elderly man looked up into the sky in an expressionless manner. The 3-colored suit of armor he was wearing was also completely unscathed, with not even a single scratch to be seen on its surface. Han Li's pupils abruptly contracted upon seeing this, and he also looked back at his opponent with a cold expression. At the same time, an item fell soundlessly into his hand, which was hidden up his sleeve. "Does this attack have a name?" The elderly man's voice rang out from within the suit of armor, and the question caught Han Li off guard a little. "Of course, I'm sure taking on my origin chi sword wasn't a pleasant experience for you," Han Li replied as a peculiar look appeared on his face. "HMPH, it was indeed quite powerful, even I was unable to completely withstand it," the elderly man harumphed coldly. As soon as his voice trailed off, a thin azure line suddenly appeared on his suit of armor. Immediately thereafter, An incision that was as smooth as a mirror's surface appeared on the seamless suit of armor, and that section of the armor crashed heavily onto the ground. Alongside the severed section of the suit of armor, one of the elderly man's huge arms had also been dismembered, and the overpowering odor of blood wafted through the air from his shoulder. However, the elderly man merely glanced at his severed arm, and it flew back of its own accord before reattaching itself to his shoulder amid a flash of white light. Immediately thereafter, he circulated his magic power within his body and made a hand seal, following which the dazzling red light appeared once again, instantly elevating the surrounding temperatures by an astonishing degree. Hanli looked down at his opponent through narrowed eyes, and he didn't attack right away. Instead, a derisive sneer appeared on his face as he scoffed. "Do you really think it's that easy to recover from a wound inflicted by my origin chi sword? What are you trying to say?" The elderly man's heart jolted with shock as he cast his gaze toward his wounded arm again, upon which a dark expression instantly appeared on his face. Blood was gushing down his reattached arm again, even though he was sure that it had been completely healed just a moment ago. As soon as you try to use your magic power, the wound will open up again. That's the true horror of the origin chi sword. Would you like to fight me without any magic power from here onward, or keep fighting me until your blood runs dry?" Hanli chuckled as he abruptly swept a sleeve through the air. A loud buzzing sound instantly erupted as several tens of golden flowers flew forth from his sleeve. As soon as they emerged from his sleeve, they immediately turned into massive, sinister-looking beetles that were around half a foot in size each. The elderly man had been extremely shocked and enraged by Han Li's words, but he managed to maintain an expressionless facade. However, that facade instantly crumbled at the sight of the golden beetles. "Gold-devouring beetles. You have mature gold-devouring beetles." A hint of fear appeared in the elderly man's eyes for the very first time. However, Han Li didn't even bother to give a reply as he made a hand seal, following which all of the gold-devouring beetles rapidly surged toward the elderly man. In the same instant, brilliant golden light erupted from his body as golden scales surfaced over his skin. Black light then flashed from his glabella, and an inky black demonic eye was revealed. At the same time, a golden halo abruptly appeared behind him, and the Provenance True Devil projection appeared within the halo. A loud thunderclap erupted from his body, and countless arcs of golden lightning appeared, following which he flipped a hand over, and the divine essence-effused mountain emerged again amid a flash of gray light. Meanwhile, he waved a hand toward the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords in the surrounding area, and all of them converged to form a giant azure sword that was around 10 feet in length, which then landed in his grasp. After doing all that, Han Li stepped forward with a cold expression on his face, covering a distance of over 100 feet with a single step as he strode directly toward the elderly man down below. The elderly man's expression darkened significantly upon seeing this. He looked down at his arm, which had ceased bleeding again after he'd unleashed a regenerative ability, then glanced at the several tens of massive golden beetles that were flying toward him. In the end, he gritted his teeth and suddenly opened his mouth to produce a purple talisman. The talisman exploded with a dull thump, and a cloud of purple mist permeated through the air before completely obscuring the elderly man's body within. Han Li faltered in midair upon witnessing this familiar scene, and his brows furrowed slightly. However, the gold-devouring beetles continued onward with single-minded ferocity, and they were submerged into the purple mist in the blink of an eye. Han Li immediately swept a sleeve toward the purple mist, dispersing it with a gust of fierce white winds, but sure enough, there was no longer anything within the mist. Blue light flashed through Han Li's eyes as he rapidly swept his gaze toward the ground down below, and he suddenly let loose a clear cry. Moments later, golden light flashed from the ground, and several tens of gold-devouring beetles emerged from the soil before disappearing up his sleeve. Even though he'd only used the beetles for a short while, Han Li could sense that close to half of his spiritual sense had been expended. Thankfully, his spiritual sense had become far more powerful after progressing to the spatial tempering stage. Otherwise, he definitely wouldn't have dared to release so many gold-devouring beetles at once. Through the use of his spirit eye ability, he was able to ascertain that the elderly man had already fled to close to 10 kilometers away as a purple shadow underground, seemingly having truly been frightened away by Han Li's powers. Han Li looked on at the fleeing purple shadow and made no effort to give chase. Even if he wanted to chase down his opponent, the elderly man's earth movement technique granted him superior speed to Han Li anyway. Furthermore, Han Li was also aware of the fact that his opponent had essentially only been frightened away by a bluff. He had been struck by the Origin Chi sword, resulting in profuse bleeding whenever he tried to use his magic power, which was obviously quite unsettling. On top of that, the vastly renowned gold-devouring beetles coupled with his immense display of power further chipped away at his opponent's confidence in winning this battle, thereby leading to him fleeing the scene. In reality, if the elderly man were to use his movement techniques to stall for time, the effect of the Origin Chi sword would soon wear off, and Han Li wouldn't be able to continue using his gold-devouring beetles for much longer, either. In that case, the winner of the battle would still be a mystery. This was why Han Li had decided against hunting down his fleeing opponent. Furthermore, even though he was quite far away from Green Light City already, Zhao Kai race reinforcements could still arrive at any moment. This was also why he'd unleashed that final Origin Chi sword strike even at the expense of his sword formation. Compared to the threat posed by the elderly man, he was more wary of Zhao Kai race reinforcements. The elderly man disappeared into the distance, while Han Li stowed away his treasures without any hesitation, then also departed as an azure thread. However, he was naturally flying away in a different direction, and he quickly also disappeared from view. Thus, the forest that had been plunged into disarray became a peaceful place once again. However, only about 15 minutes later, spiritual light flashed in the sky, and two streaks of light rapidly hurtled forth from Green Light City. After just a few flashes, they arrived in the air above the forest, following which the light receded to reveal a pair of humanoid figures. One of them was the elderly man who had just fled the scene, and he had reverted back to his original form. His companion was none other than the other body integration stage being among their ranks, the silver-robed middle-aged man. He really has already left. At that person's speed, he must be close to 100,000 kilometers away now, the elderly man said with a frustrated expression as he appraised the ruined forest down below. Of course he's already left. Only an insane person would continue to remain here. He must already be too far away for the profound heaven-shifting disc to be effective. Besides, we've already used it once today, and we'll have to wait at least 3 days before we can use it again. I'm rather curious, just how is a mere spatial tempering stage being able to harm you, brother too? The middle-aged man asked in a contemplative manner as he looked down at the massive crater on the ground below. An awkward look appeared on the elderly man's face upon hearing this, but that was quickly replaced by a furious expression as he glanced at his own shoulder. I was too complacent and became trapped in that man's sword formation. The sword formation was extremely powerful and difficult to deal with. On top of that, he possessed a few other powerful abilities and treasures as well, so I had no choice but to retreat. Oh, by the way, he also possesses a few dozens of mature gold-devouring beetles. What? Gold-devouring beetles? The middle-aged had remained quite composed initially, but his expression changed drastically at the mention of these beetles. If it weren't for those beetles, I wouldn't have fled the battle, the elderly man said with a bitter and resentful expression. If he possesses a few dozens of those beetles, then even true holy race beings would be wary of this man in battle. However, if it's less than 100, then top-grade wood or stone treasures should still be able to temporarily trap them. The middle-aged man finally managed to recompose himself after a while. If he had more than 100 mature gold-devouring beetles, then I would have urged you to flee this place right away. How would I dare to bring you back to this place? The elderly man chuckled with a wry smile on his face. In the face of a swarm of thousands of mature gold-devouring beetles, even holy race beings would be killed for sure. I've heard that a swarm of mature gold-devouring beetles that numbered in the tens of thousands once appeared on the Thunder Continent, and the 3 or 4 minor races nearby were all eradicated by the swarm of beetles with ease. At the time, a super race used the profound heavenly treasure, the heaven-vanquishing hammer, to smash open a spatial rift and funnel all of these spirit insects into a space outside the spirit realm. Otherwise, they would have wreaked even more havoc on the continent, the middle-aged man mused. At this moment, a thought suddenly occurred to the middle-aged, and his expression changed slightly as he asked, "But then again, nurturing gold-devouring beetles is extremely difficult. It's one of the most troublesome types of spirit insects to breed, and many people have expended a vast amount of effort to nurture them without any success. I wonder what power that man hails from to be able to bring out a few dozens of those beetles at once. Could he be a member of the 13 heavenly cloud races?" The elderly man contemplated the notion for a moment before shaking his head. No, The treasures I was carrying exhibited no reaction toward him, and I was unable to pinpoint what kind of being he was from his physical appearance either. In that case, things will be a little troublesome for us. If he's carrying a jade box with him, then it'll be very difficult for us to recover it, the middle-aged man said with furrowed brows. How many boxes did you recover, fellow Taoist Ning? The elderly man asked. I managed to secure 2 boxes. That myriad ancient being was quite sly and cunning. He tried to threaten me with the destruction of the box in an attempt to get away. Thankfully, my blood-melting technique is quite proficient in sneak attacks, so I was able to catch him off guard and kill him on the spot. The middle-aged man flipped a hand over as he spoke, and 2 identical boxes appeared in his grasp, both of which had restriction talismans plastered onto their surfaces. It turned out that the big-headed being still had 2 jade boxes left, even after giving out 1 each to Han Li's trio. The elderly man nodded as he rustled his sleeve to summon a jade box as well. It was none other than the one that he'd obtained from the green-skinned being. In that case, we have 3 boxes. How many boxes did Hong Yin report that the myriad ancient being was in possession of? Perhaps the elderly man had truly forgotten, or he was simply asking for confirmation. In any case, he turned to his companion and raised the question with an inquisitive look on his face. 5 or 6, the information he sent back to us wasn't very accurate either, the middle-aged man replied after a brief hesitation. 5 or 6, what a troublesome number. That means that man is carrying at least 2 jade boxes with him, the elderly man sighed. I'm afraid so. On top of that, he appears to be quite powerful, so Hong Yin must have fallen by his hands. We can't allow him to get away with this. The middle-aged man's expression darkened as he spoke in a cold voice. But he's completely disappeared now. How are we going to find him again? The elderly man asked. We obviously won't be able to do that on our own, but don't forget that most of the cities in this area are under our race's control. We can contact the closest few cities using our myriad distance talismans and request assistance from them to hunt down that man. The people deployed to search for him don't have to be very powerful either. All they have to do is to startle him into showing himself, and we'll immediately get to him using a teleportation formation, the middle-aged man suggested. That's certainly worth a try. The elderly man didn't have high hopes for the proposed course of action, but he couldn't think of any better alternatives, so he still nodded in agreement in the end. Immediately thereafter, the elderly man rustled a sleeve, and a green rock tablet appeared in his hand. He then quickly inscribed something on the tablet with his finger, leaving lines of faint golden text on its surface. Moments later, the elderly man had finished writing his message, and he laid a hand over the tablet, upon which the lines of text instantly disappeared amid a flash of light. Let's return to the battle arc first. That myriad ancient being set up a self-detonating formation in the city, but our detection treasures managed to discover the formation, and someone has since disabled it. However, there are still many other things to be taken care of. We'll be busy for quite a while to come, the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. Looks like we have no choice. The elderly man naturally had no objections, and the 2 of them returned the way they'd come as 2 streaks of light, quickly disappearing into the distance. Han Li fled for around 500,000 kilometers, and only after he was sure that no Jiao Kai beings could possibly chase him down did he decelerate to his normal speed. After just a prolonged period of high-speed flight, even Han Li was feeling a little worse for wear. Thus, he swept a hand over his storage bracelet, and a pair of green stones immediately appeared in his grasp. These were 2 top-grade wood attribute spirit stones. Spirit stones of this caliber were quite rare, but in his current perilous situation, Han Li couldn't afford to be stingy, so he immediately began to absorb the spiritual power within the spirit stones as he held on in each hand. Thankfully, the surrounding area was extremely bleak and desolate. Han Li picked a mountain at random to descending onto, then sat with his legs crossed beneath a large, yet extremely obscure tree to begin recovering his magic power. The Spring Dawn Sword formation was indeed extraordinarily powerful, but it also expended a huge amount of magic power to unleash. In particular, that final strike from the Origin Chi sword had been extremely draining. Thus, Han Li sat on the summit of the mountain beneath the large tree, and no one else passed through the area. After about half a day had passed, Han Li had recovered most of his magic power. He reopened his eyes with an elated expression on his face, and displayed no intention of staying here any longer. Thus, he stowed away the spirit stone and hurtled into the air as a streak of azure light again. After flying for over 1,000 feet, the streak of green light suddenly became very blurry and barely visible. Within the azure light, Han Li pulled out a jade slip. This was none other than the map of the surrounding area that Han Li had obtained from Qing Zio prior to teleporting to Green Light Island. Even though the Flame Coral Islands had been out of contact with the Thunder Continent for thousands of years, most of the things on the map should have remained the same. Thus, Han Li's spiritual sense seeped into the jade slip as he began a search for a suitable route from here onward. He didn't know how much control the Jiao Kai race had over this area, but he definitely wasn't going to visit the few nearby cities. Instead, he was planning to skirt around all of these cities and head toward the largest city that belonged to the 13 heavenly cloud races in this area, Golden Armor City. It was said that this city was situated in an extremely important location, so not only was it the largest city that belonged to the 13 heavenly cloud races in this area, it was also guarded by a large number of elite forces from the 13 races. At the same time, there were also many high-grade beings defending the city. If he weren't mistaken, the Jiao Kai race was most likely planning to eradicate all of the nearby cities first before attacking Golden Armor City. With that in mind, Han Li looked up at the suns in the sky to recalibrate himself, then flew toward the direction that he decided on. As Han Li was intentionally trying to skirt around the nearby cities, he was choosing to fly over extremely barren and desolate areas, and during the first few days of his journey, he encountered no difficulties whatsoever. He only saw the occasional cultivator hurriedly passing through the area from afar, heading toward the few nearby cities. Han Li could only shake his head with a forlorn look upon seeing this, but made no effort to warn them against traveling to their destinations. All of these people had extremely low cultivation bases around the foundation establishment stage and core formation stage. In the face of the sudden attack that the Jiao Kai race had launched against the area, they naturally pinned their hopes on traveling to cities in order to escape the area using their teleportation formations, or to seek protection from the high-grade beings in those cities. After flying on his own for over 10 days, Han Li finally encountered a group of armored Jiao Kai race warriors. There weren't all that many of them, only around a dozen or so, but each of them was riding a snowy white twin-headed falcon steed. The most powerful being among them was a nascent soul cultivator, while the others all possessed core formation stage cultivation bases. Han Li's heart immediately sank upon seeing these armored warriors. If he recalled correctly, there were no cities nearby, so why had these Jiao Kai beings appeared in such a secluded place? Han Li was quite bewildered by this development, but he wasn't very alarmed as these beings were nowhere near powerful enough to pose a threat to him anyway. However, even though he was capable of killing these armored warriors with ease, he concealed himself instead and only revealed himself again after they'd departed. He looked on at the group of armored warriors in the distance with a dark expression on his face before continuing on his way. However, after encountering the first group of Jiao Kai race armored warriors, he went on to encounter a second group, a third group, a fourth group. The regularity at which Han Li was encountering these groups was gradually on the rise. Their vast cultivation-based disparities ensured that Han Li could conceal himself from them with ease, but he was still struck by a sense of foreboding. Could it be that this entire area was under the control of the Jiao Kai race? Just as Han Li was starting to become alerted to his situation, the Jiao Kai race conquered a city that was several times larger than Green Light City. Within the city, there were 3 high-grade Jiao Kai beings situated within a palace, conversing with one another about this matter. A red-haired woman and a thin and shriveled elderly man stood on either side of a golden chair in the hall, while a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s sat on the chair. The woman had a set of beautiful facial features, but there was a faint metallic silver hue to her skin. On top of that, she had a pair of purplish golden eyes, and if one were to look into those eyes, they'd be struck by a piercing pain in their own eyes. The woman had a small horn that was several inches long growing from her glabella, and it was glittering and translucent like an intricate artistic masterpiece. Both the elderly man and the red-haired woman were spatial tempering stage beings, yet they were appraising the young woman with extremely respectful expressions on their faces. "Has there still been no sign of him?" the young woman suddenly asked. Her voice was quite pleasing to the ear, but her expression was quite cold. Letter 1D5F3, letter 1D69B, letter 1D5F2, letter 1D556, letter 1D6A0, letter 1D6AT, letter 1D6AC, letter 1D698, letter 1D46. "I'm afraid not, Lady Yin. Our scouts have yet to return with any useful information. Perhaps he found an obscure location to hide in. In that case, it would be quite difficult to find him, the elderly man replied in a respectful manner. It's very unlikely that he's hidden himself somewhere. He already knows that we're attacking this area, so he must be well aware of the fact that if we were to seize complete control over this area, he'll be dead no matter how powerful he is. I also didn't think that we'd encounter such a big fish so early on in our campaign. If we could capture that man alive, it would be quite the accolade, the woman said with furrowed brows. We're aware of just how important that man is to the 13 heavenly cloud races, so we definitely won't allow him to escape from this place. We've already sent out a large number of scouts to scour through this entire area, as well as 2 groups of powerful beings that are constantly at the ready. As soon as we receive news of his location, those 2 groups will teleport over right away. Teleportation of that kind is restricted to within a certain distance and will require a huge price to be paid, but I'm sure it'll be worth it to capture that man. The red-haired woman chimed in a respectful manner. All right, I'll leave it to you two then. By the way, wasn't Envoy 2 requesting our assistance to capture someone a few days ago? The woman suddenly asked. Yes, Master 2 and the others did indeed distribute a portrait to all of the nearby cities, asking them to keep an eye out for a certain man. Apparently, they're searching for an upper race 7th tier being who's carrying something important in the context of the mission. The elderly man replied after a brief hesitation. HMPH, they really are useless. Even with such a huge cultivation base advantage, they still let a mere upper race being get away. If it weren't for the fact that it was already a part of the plan to put this area into complete lockdown, we wouldn't even pay any heed to such a ridiculous request. The woman scoffed as a derisive look flashed through her eyes. Neither the elderly man nor the red-haired woman dared to say anything in response. Speaking on this matter, though, I'm rather curious about just what the elders sent those out to obtain. They even asked me to loan them one of only 2 fortress-level battle arcs in my possession. As a result of that setback, we had to change our plans, and we still haven't taken over this area, even now. The young woman chuckled coldly, seemingly very displeased with the current arrangement. Lady Yin, the panel of elders ordered us to loan them the battle arc, so we can't go against those orders. Seeing as the panel of elders is holding the mission in such high regard, it's safe to assume that the items they've been deployed to secure must be extremely important for our race. Thankfully, the elders deployed a new group of battle puppets to us, and those will be enough for us to completely control this area. At present, there are only 2 cities left in this area that haven't been conquered by our forces, the red-haired woman replied in a cautious manner. Those puppets are relatively useful in large-scale battles, but they're useless for patrol and tracking purposes. Most of our forces have been deployed to lock down this area, and the remaining 2 cities both have powerful defenses, so we still haven't been able to conquer them. It looks like we can't afford to keep stalling like this. We have to wrest complete control over this area before the rest of our army arrives. I have no choice but to make a trip in person. Otherwise, I won't be able to answer to the panel of elders. The woman mused as a cold light flashed through her eyes. The elderly man faltered slightly upon hearing this before a fawning smile appeared on his face. If Lady Yin gets involved, then we'd be able to conquer the remaining 2 cities with ease. Then it's decided. Once everything has been taken care of here, we'll set off on the battle arc tomorrow, the young woman instructed. Yes. The red-haired woman and the elderly man hurriedly bowed in unison. Half a month later, Han Li was situated under a certain lush tree at the foot of a small mountain. He wore a thin black veil that completely concealed his aura, yet he wore a grim expression as he looked up into the sky. Not far above him, there were 2 identical silver islands hovering in midair. These 2 silver islands were extremely similar in appearance to the one that had appeared over Green Light City, except it was only several thousand feet in size. Even so, the 2 smaller battle arcs were still surrounded by a vast horde of silver-armored warriors and twin-headed giant falcons. The Jiao Kai race had deployed such heavy forces only to bring down a foreign being whom they'd already surrounded. This was a man who appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, with grayish-white hair and a set of peculiar facial features. He had his hands clasped behind his back and was standing atop a flying arc in a stationary manner. There was also a beastly puppet on either side of him. One of them possessed the body of a horse, yet the head of a worm, and it was several tens of feet in size, radiating shimmering azure light. The other puppet was a strange lion with 7 heads, one of which was larger than the other 6. It had an extremely fierce appearance and was over 200 feet in size. Even at first glance, one could tell that these two puppets were quite powerful. The wariness being exercised by the nearby Jiao Kai beings also seemed to further vindicate this notion. Han Li looked on with intrigue at the confrontation that ensued. Back when he had first discovered so many Jiao Kai beings and the pair of battle arcs in this place, he had been given quite a fright. However, he then immediately discovered that there were no beings of the spatial tempering stage or above among the Jiao Kai beings, and they'd all surrounded a foreign being. Thus, his curiosity had been piqued, and he snuck over to a nearby area to survey the situation. Han Li was able to immediately identify the foreign being's cultivation base. He was only deity transformation stage being. However, the auras being emitted by the two puppets on either side of him indicated that they were equivalent in power to spatial tempering stage beings. Furthermore, one of them was at the mid-spatial tempering stage, while the other was at the late spatial tempering stage. The might of the two puppets was naturally quite astonishing to Han Li. However, what was even more confusing to him was why this foreign being didn't simply deploy his powerful puppets to kill these Jiao Kai beings and giant falcons. Why were they seemingly caught in a stalemate instead? There was indeed a large number of those giant falcons and armored warriors, but the most powerful beings among them were only a few deity transformation stage leaders. The only potential cause for concern was the two silver battle arcs, as it was unknown what abilities they possessed. Just as these thoughts were running through Han Li's mind, the surrounded foreign being up above glanced at the Jiao Kai beings around him before suddenly making a hand seal, and the two puppets finally sprang into action. The worm-headed horse puppet abruptly spared open its wings, and they transformed into a pair of massive blades that shot forth through the air amid a flash of azure light. In the next instant, the azure light swept into the surrounding area, and a dozen or so giant falcons and armored warriors were instantly sliced in half. Meanwhile, the lion puppet opened all 7 of its mouths at once, and countless fireballs erupted from within, forming a sea of flames in the blink of an eye that inundated all of the enemies in another direction. The surrounding armored warriors were initially quite alarmed by this sudden development, but under the commands of the deity transformation stage leaders, all of them raised their blades and unleashed countless attacks toward the two puppets. At the same time, all of the giant falcons also rose up into the air before also pouncing toward the puppets. All of a sudden, explosive boom and sharp screeches rang out incessantly as an intense battle ensued. The result of the clash was much the same as Han Li had expected. As soon as the two spatial tempering stage puppets sprang into action, the armored warriors and giant falcons were completely no match. They were either sliced into several segments or plummeted from the sky amid howls of anguish, with raging flames incinerating their bodies. However, the Jiao Kai beings seemed to have anticipated that this would happen in advance, so they weren't all that unsettled. Instead, many of the armored warriors suddenly patted something on their waists, and swathes of 5-colored light were sent surging toward the long-haired foreign being. Before they had even gotten close to the foreign being, the 5-colored light transformed into a series of large nets that hurtled toward him. It appeared that the Jiao Kai beings were trying to capture the foreign being alive. Han Li was quite surprised to see this. Right at this moment, the foreign being let loose a cold harumph before suddenly stomping down on the flying arc underfoot. The arc immediately flashed with yellow light, following which a dense yellow light barrier appeared. The foreign being then made a hand seal, and a layer of white lightning arcs instantly surfaced over the light barrier. As soon as those large nets descended, they were blasted into balls of spiritual light by the flashing arcs of lightning. Before the armored warriors had a chance to employ any other tactics, the long-haired foreign being flipped both of his hands over to summon a pair of shimmering golden treasures that resembled round shields, then tossed them up into the air. The two treasures shot forth amid a loud whistling sound, and all of the surrounding armored beings appraised the pair of treasures with alarm and wariness in their eyes. However, the two golden treasures merely circled around in the air before whizzing back to the foreign being, much to the bemusement of all of the surrounding Jiao Kai beings. Following a dull thump, the two shields crashed into the foreign being's body, upon which both of them began to emit a ball of piercing golden light. Immediately thereafter, the foreign being completely disappeared, but a large golden ball with a diameter of around 10 feet had appeared in his place. The ball was shimmering with golden light, looking as if it had been constructed from pure gold. Furthermore, there were all types of runes carved all over its surface, striking the onlooker with a sense of mystery and intrigue. A string of peculiar screeching sounds rang out from the golden ball, following which countless sharp blades that were each around a foot in length appeared all over its surface. The ball then hurtled into HT crowd, leaving a trail of afterimages in its wake. The sharp blades on the surface of the golden ball didn't look to be anything special, but all of the armored warriors that came into contact with them were sliced into several pieces without being able to offer up any resistance. All of the attacks that were launched toward the golden ball were also repelled by its high rotational speed. In the blink of an eye, the golden ball had joined the horse puppet as they flew toward the same direction together. As for the seven-headed lion puppet, it was following close behind them with fireballs continuing to surge relentlessly out of its mouths. Most of the fireballs were aimed up at the giant falcons that were flying at higher altitudes, thereby preventing them from attempting to swoop down from above. The three combined to form a lethal trio. Close to 100 armored warriors and giant falcons were slain in an instant, and the trio was just about to escape. All of a sudden, one of the deity transformation stage Jiao Kai beings let loose a loud cry, and the armored warriors around the foreign being and his puppets suddenly backed away, retreating in all directions. The twin-headed giant falcons up above also dispersed, thereby creating a large area of empty space around the golden ball and the two puppets, with a radius of close to 1,000 feet. The foreign being within the golden ball faltered upon seeing this. Right at this moment, the two battle arcs in the sky finally sprang into action. The hundreds of crystalline pillars on the undersides of the battle arcs lit up in unison, following which white pillars of light came raining down from above. The white light completely encompassed the area of open space that had just appeared, and a string of deafening explosions rang out in rapid succession. The golden ball and both of the puppets were instantly inundated by this white light. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the armored warriors and giant falcons surrounded their target once again, reorganizing their formation during this period of respite. Letter 1D4 BB, letter 1D4 C7, letter 1D4 52, letter 1D6 26, letter 1D6 38, letter 1D4 52, letter 1D4 B8, letter 2134, letter 1D6 2E. The attacks from the two battle arcs quickly subsided, and the white light gradually faded. Hanli narrowed his eyes and focused his gaze up above to discover that a shimmering blue giant umbrella with a radius of over 100 feet had appeared. Beneath the giant umbrella, the upper half of the foreign being's body was protruding out of the massive golden ball, and his brows were tightly furrowed in a concerned expression as he quickly assessed his surroundings. Meanwhile, his two puppets had also remained completely unscathed. On this occasion, the foreign being didn't seem to want to delay any further. He let loose a low cry before raising a hand and waving it up into the air. The giant umbrella above him immediately shrank at a rapid rate amid a flash of spiritual light, dwindling down to several inches in size before landing in his grasp. He then twisted around, and his upper body disappeared back into the golden ball. At the same time, the two puppets flew through the air again, and another fierce battle ensued. This battle was quite similar to the last one. The armored warriors and giant falcons were still no match for their opponents, and within moments, almost half of them had perished. Just as the foreign being was about to escape again, the lion puppet suddenly ceased its fireball output. Red light flashed from its body several times in quick succession, following which all 7 of its heads drooped, and it fell completely stationary on the spot. The armored warriors nearby initially faltered upon seeing this before being greatly spurred on by this development. A few of them instantly raised their hands, and 5 colored lights surged through the air, forming several large nets that completely ensnared the lion puppet. The armored warriors dragged the nets toward them, and the lion puppet was forcibly captured. Without the fireball output from the lion puppet, the giant falcons up above no longer had any qualms as they flapped their wings violently and swooped down at an alarming rate. Large blades of wind came hurtling down from above, and as they struck the golden ball, the golden light emanating from its surface tremored, and its rotational speed was hampered drastically. Thus, the foreign being was surrounded again, and he was in a far worse situation than before. To further compound his woes, the horse puppet also ceased to function for some reason a short while later, and it was also captured by the Jiao Kai beings. Thus, the golden ball was the only target left, and despite its astonishing defensive prowess, it was struggling to hold on in the face of all of the attacks being thrown at it. Hanli heaved a faint sigh upon seeing this. The foreign being was able to manipulate these puppets that were far more powerful than himself and last so long against such a vast number of opponents, clearly indicating that he was no ordinary being. However, under the current circumstances, it appeared that it would only be a matter of time before he was captured. He didn't know why the Jiao Kai being seemed to be intent on capturing the foreign being alive, but there was no need to expose himself and draw potential trouble. Thus, he turned away and prepared to leave. However, right at this moment, the foreign being's voice suddenly rang out from within the golden ball. "Senior, I am Jia Tianmu of the myriad ancient race. If you can help me escape, I'm willing to reward you with a sentient puppet once we return to the myriad ancient race." The foreign being hadn't employed any voice transmission techniques. Instead, he'd injected some of his spiritual power into his voice, making it clearly audible to everyone within a radius of several kilometers. And Li initially faltered upon hearing this, before being struck by the urge to cuss out loud. He didn't know how the foreign being had been able to detect his presence, but he definitely didn't have any good intentions by exposing him like this. As expected, one of the leaders of the Jiao Kai beings instantly waved a hand upon hearing this, and a few armored warriors as well as a dozen or so giant falcons were instantly deployed toward the small mountain where Han Li was hiding. These beings were somehow able to ascertain his rough location, but they were clearly unable to pinpoint exactly where he was, as evidenced by the fact that they were flying around the small mountain in a rather confused manner. Han Li's lips twitched, but he wasn't fearful of this development in the slightest. These Jiao Kai beings and giant falcons were far too weak to pose any threat to him, so the only potentially troublesome opponents would be those two battle arcs. Even so, he was naturally enraged by the fact that the foreign being had forcibly exposed him like this. Thus, a cold look appeared on his face as he swept a sleeve through the air, and several tens of inch-long flying swords shot forth from within. These flying swords then transformed into azure threads before disappearing into space in a flash. In the next instant, several azure threads appeared close to the Jiao Kai beings and giant falcons up above. Following a flash of azure light, all of those beings were sliced into several segments, and their dismembered remains came crashing down amid a rain of blood. Immediately thereafter, Han Li appeared beneath the large tree that he'd been hiding under, and a loud thunderclap rang out behind him as a pair of wings emerged on his back. He flapped those wings and disappeared on the spot amid a gentle breeze. In the next instant, a thunderclap rang out right at the center of the Jiao Kai beings, and Han Li reappeared amid a flash of azure and white lightning. He made a hand seal, and 72 azure threads erupted from all parts of his body. These azure threads then blurred before multiplying at a rapid rate. In the blink of an eye, azure light was flashing throughout the entire sky, and howls of anguish rang out in quick succession as all of the armored warriors and giant falcons in the area were felled in just the span of a few breaths. No one was able to withstand Han Li's sword threads. Within mere moments, all of the enemies around Han Li had been slain. Only then did the surrounding Jiao Kai beings return to their senses, and all of them reflexively retreated even further with alarmed expressions on their faces. However, Han Li had no intention of stopping here. He swept a sleeve through the air, and two black shadows instantly shot forth from within. Golden and black lights flashed, following which a small leopard-like beast and a small black monkey that was around a foot tall appeared. "Kill them all, don't let anyone leave alive," Han Li commanded with a cold expression on his face. As soon as Han Li finished issuing that command, the leopard-like beast swayed to conjure up a dozen or so identical projections, all of which instantly rushed into the crowd. Meanwhile, black light flashed from the small monkey's body, and it swelled to several tens of times its original size, transforming into a massive black ape that was over 200 feet tall. The ape thumped its chest while letting loose a cold harumph, upon which a swath of yellow light swept forth from within its large nostrils. All of the twin-headed falcons that were struck by this yellow light plummeted from the sky as if they were inebriated. The giant ape swung its fists violently up above, smashing the giant falcons into mincemeat as if they were nothing more than pesky insects. As for Han Li, he was unleashing his flying swords on the surrounding enemies once again. With each and every flash of an azure thread, at least one armored warrior or giant falcon was slain without any resistance. In the blink of an eye, almost all of the armored warriors and giant falcons had been slain by Han Li and his two spirit beasts. Soon, there were less than 100 armored warriors that remained, and fearful expressions had finally appeared on their faces. One of the deity transformation stage leaders issued a loud command, and all of them dispersed before fleeing for their lives toward the two battle arcs up above. Hanli immediately rose up into the air in hot pursuit without any hesitation, and azure threads continued to harvest more lives as they flashed through the air. All of a sudden, a resounding boom erupted overhead, and Hanli's heart stirred as he hurriedly looked up. At this moment, brilliant light began to radiate from the crystalline pillars on the undersides of the two silver battle arcs, following which over 100 pillars of light came raining down without any regard for the Jiao beings nearby. Hanli harumphed coldly as he flapped his wings, and he disappeared on the spot amid a loud thunderclap. Thus, all of the pillars of light struck nothing but empty air. In the next instant, Hanli reappeared above one of the battle arcs before making a grabbing motion downward in an expressionless manner. An inky black palm extended itself out of his sleeve, then pressed down in a seemingly gentle manner. Gray light flashed, and a miniature black mountain emerged from his palm. The mountain then swelled drastically to over 10,000 feet in size before crashing down toward the battle arc with devastating might. The divine essence-effused mountain had become even more gigantic than the battle arc, and it instantly cast a colossal shadow over the entire battle arc. The Jiao beings within the battle arc were stunned to see this, and they hurriedly spurred on the battle arc to try and evade the attack, but it was already far too late. The underside of the giant mountain crashed into the battle arc amid a resounding boom, and despite the fact that the mountain was repelled slightly by the force of the collision, most of the battle arc's surface had caved in significantly. At the same time, it was rammed down above, crashing heavily onto the ground below. Close to half of the entire arc had sunk into the ground, and it was quite clear that it wouldn't be doing any more flying anytime soon. However, a hint of surprise appeared in Hanli's eyes upon seeing this. The fact that the battle arc hadn't been completely destroyed by the divine essence-effused mountain indicated that the materials used to construct it were most likely not inferior to normal treasures. Constructing such a massive battle arc would require the expenditure of a vast amount of such materials. Thinking back to the giant island that Hanli had seen in Green Light City, which was far more gigantic than even these two battle arcs, he couldn't help but draw a sharp breath. The insane wealth of the Jiao race finally dawned on him. They really were worthy of being known as one of the most powerful races in the spirit realm. Despite the shock in his heart, Hanli displayed no intention of giving his opponents any respite. He flicked his fingers toward the black mountain from afar in quick succession, and the mountain came crashing down again. An earth-shattering boom rang out as the silver battle arc was flattened into a pancake of scrap metal beneath the colossal mountain. The Jiao beings operating the battle arc may not have been killed as a result, but they most certainly wouldn't be enjoying themselves in there, either. However, much to Hanli's surprise, silver light shimmered from the battle arc, and it was slowly repairing itself despite the horrendous condition it was in. Hanli raised his eyebrows upon seeing this before immediately making a grabbing motion. Several tens of azure threads instantly shot forth out of thin air, all of which converged into Hanli's grasp. Following a flash of piercing azure light, the azure threads formed a giant sword that was around 10 feet in length. However, its surface was shimmering with azure light, and it didn't appear to actually possess any substance. Hanli grabbed onto the hilt of the sword without a second thought, and prepared to bring it down upon the crippled battle arc down below. However, right at this moment, an urgent cry from the foreign being suddenly rang out. "Look out, senior! Letter 1D5F3, letter 1D5FF, letter 1D41E, letter 1D556, letter 1D604, letter 1D5F2, letter 1D680, letter 1D560, letter 1D55E. Hanli faltered slightly upon hearing this before abruptly sensing a burst of immense spiritual power exploding beside him. Without any time for further thought, Hanli swiveled around and lashed out with his giant sword toward the direction where the spiritual power was erupting from. A streak of azure sword chi that was over 100 feet in length instantly swept through the air and struck the burst of spiritual power. The two clashed and exploded over 300 feet away from Hanli, forming a pillar of azure and black wind that surged up into the sky, creating quite an astonishing sight to behold from afar. Hanli narrowed his eyes as he focused his gaze on that direction, and he discovered that 4 beings of different appearances had appeared in the air above the silver battle arc. One of them was a humanoid being with a set of pale facial features. His feet were bare, and he was holding a strange transparent blade as he appraised Han Li with a hint of surprise in his eyes. It appeared that he was the one who had unleashed that sneak attack just then. The other three beings consisted of an elderly woman, a midget, and a giant Neanderthal-like man wearing a beast-thighed garment. Han Li swept his spiritual sense toward them to find that the one who had just attacked him was a mid-spatial tempering stage being, while the other three were all at the early spatial tempering stage. He had already assessed the surrounding area and failed to discover these four, so he was unsure of where they had popped up from. These four spatial tempering stage beings were certainly going to be more troublesome to take care of than those armored warriors, but they still posed no threat to Han Li. He was only slightly curious about how they had managed to escape his detection. "You've got some guts to destroy a battle arc from our Jiao Kai race. From the looks of it, you don't seem to be from the 13 heavenly cloud races. In any case, we'll just have to capture you and interrogate you later," the pale-faced being said in a cold voice. He then cast his gaze toward another direction. There, the foreign being had emerged from the golden ball again, and he was appraising the four spatial tempering stage being with a dark expression on his face. "Mr. Jia, I've heard that you're not even a purebred myriad ancient being. In that case, why would you insist on fighting for the 13 heavenly cloud races? Prior to coming here, the elders of our race specifically mentioned you and offered much praise for your proficiency in the art of puppetry. The elders have also promised that if you're willing to join our Jiao Kai race, they would transform your body at all costs to give you the purest bloodline, and I can guarantee that your cultivation base would be significantly enhanced as a result. Given suitable opportunities in the future, it wouldn't be impossible for you to become holy race being," the pale-faced being said in a respectful voice. After a brief silence, Jia Tianmu shook his head expressionlessly and replied, "Join the Jiao Kai race. I have no interest in that. I may not have the purest bloodline, but I'm greatly indebted to the elders our myriad ancient race, so I won't pledge my allegiance to any other race. Besides, I'm sure you're not just trying to capture me for my puppet refinement skills. You're also planning to interrogate me for some secrets of the 13 heavenly cloud races, right?" As opposed to becoming enraged by Jia Tianmu's rejection, the pale-faced being smiled and continued, "Mr. Jia, do you still think you have a chance of escaping this place? Your puppets are indeed very powerful, but you must be close to exhausting your supply of spirit stones, right? At your current cultivation base, you pose no threat to us at all. We don't have to do things by force, so I'd advise you to hand yourself over to us." Jia Tianmu's expression remained completely unchanged upon seeing this, but he cast his gaze toward Han Li. The pale-faced being faltered slightly upon seeing Jia Tianmu's reaction before also turning to Han Li in an expressionless manner. "Are you counting on him to rescue you? So be it. We'll get rid of this pesky meddler first then. Are you going to surrender, or will we have to destroy your body and capture your soul?" the pale-faced being asked in a cold voice. Han Li's pupils contracted upon hearing this, but he then chuckled and replied, "You sure can talk big. I wonder if you're all talk or if you can actually walk the walk as well." The pale-faced being was rather surprised by Han Li's response. He carefully appraised Han Li for a moment before a thought suddenly seemed to have occurred to him, and his expression suddenly changed as he turned to the elderly woman in their group. "This man is a little familiar. Is he the one that Envoy 2 asked us to capture a few days ago? Now that you mention it, he really is identical to the man on the portrait. He must be quite powerful to have been able to escape from Envoy 2. The elderly woman nodded as a cold light flashed through her eyes. The other two beings in the group were both rather surprised to hear this. "Haha, is he really the one? In that case, we're in luck. We'll be completing 2 missions at once. Come to think of it, it's all thanks to him for destroying the other battle arc. Otherwise, if the other team were to be teleported here as well, we'd have to split the reward for completing these missions with them," the giant man clad in beast-thighed guffawed. "HMPH, you seem quite confident, fellow Taoist Li. I'd advise you to be more careful against such a powerful opponent, though. Otherwise, you could be in for a nasty surprise," the midget chuckled coldly. "Hee, no matter how powerful he is, there's no way he can take on all 4 of us on his own," the huge man chuckled nonchalantly in response. "Of course he's no match for the 4 of us, but are you sure we can stop him if he insists on getting away?" the midget countered as he pursed his lips. The group of 4 conversed casually with one another, and they seemed to all be on good terms with each other. The price that had to be paid to teleport them here was most likely quite a hefty one, and from the sounds of it, there was supposed to be another team teleported to this place as well. However, due to the fact that one of the battle arcs had been destroyed, they were the only ones who had ended up here. Letter 1D41F, letter 1D5FF, letter 1D41E, letter 1D6AT, letter 1D6A0, letter 1D41E, letter 1D554, letter 1D560, letter 1D696. The fact that they had deployed so many spatial tempering stage beings just to pursue a deity transformation stage, being further highlighted that the foreign being was no ordinary character. However, the fact that these beings had managed to identify him right away was rather surprising. It seemed that the body integration stage being from Green Light City still hadn't given up on him. This made Han Li even more curious about what lay within the 2 jade boxes that the big-headed being had given to him. They clearly had to be harboring extremely important items for the body integration to be so intent on capturing him. Even as these thoughts were racing through Han Li's mind, he remained completely expressionless. At this moment, the leopard Kirin beast and weeping soul beast also returned to Han Li's side, then glowered at the 4 beings with vicious looks in their eyes. However, they were also aware that these 4 beings were far more powerful than the ones they'd slain before, so they didn't rush in head first and attack in a reckless manner. Meanwhile, the paleface being turned to Han Li and seemed to be about to say something, but Han Li didn't give him a chance to speak, abruptly sweeping a sleeve toward all 4 beings instead. Several tens of azure threads immediately split up into 4 groups before hurtling toward the 4 beings like lightning, reaching them in the blink of an eye. All 4 of the spatial tempering stage Jiao Kai beings were given a massive fright by this development. They had witnessed Han Li using those sword threads to slay the armored warriors earlier, yet the speed being displayed by these threads was significantly superior to before, and in their shock and horror, they could only set up defensive measures or take evasive action in a panicked manner. The paleface being swayed and disappeared on the spot amid a plume of white smoke. Light shimmered from the elderly woman's body, conjuring up several identical projections. All of the projections were shattered in a flash by the azure threads, but the woman was nowhere to be found. The midget's expression changed in the instant that the azure threads came hurtling toward him, and he immediately made a hand seal, upon which a shimmering silver cloud appeared beneath his feet. The cloud swayed before abruptly carrying him away as a ball of silver light, traveling at a speed that was not inferior by much compared to the azure thread. Only the giant man chose to remain on the spot and take the azure threads head-on. Red light flashed from his hand, and a massive axe that was around 10 feet in size appeared in his grasp. There were scorching crimson flames burning along the axe, and he positioned it before him like a shield. The axe had been refined many types of precious fire attribute materials, thereby granting it immense power and making it just as resolute as top-grade defensive treasures. This was why the man had decided to use it as shield even after witnessing all of the armored warriors being sliced apart like cabbage by the azure threads. However, as soon as the man raised the massive axe, a burst of azure light flashed, and the axe suddenly became weightless in his hands. He looked down to discover that his axe had been severed into 7 or 8 segments by the azure threads in an instant, so he was left holding only a section of its hilt. Before he even had a chance to make a single sound, he was diced upon into chunks of flesh and blood. Even his soul was completely eradicated by the azure threads before it had a chance to escape. Arg, fellow Taoist Li, the paleface being yelled with shock and fury as he reappeared over 300 feet away. The midget and the elderly woman had also appeared elsewhere, and both of them were horrified by what they saw. They were aware that Han Li was far more powerful than his cultivation base suggested, but they didn't think that one of their companions would be killed in virtually the blink of an eye. However, before the 3 of them had a chance to try and avenge their fallen comrade, the azure threads flashed and surged toward them again. After witnessing just how fearsome these azure threads were in person, the 3 beings naturally didn't dare to try and keep them at bay with their treasures. As such, they were forced to unleash their movement techniques and take evasive measures once again. Thus, the 3 spatial tempering stage beings were forced to flee for their lives, seemingly completely powerless in the face of Han Li's domineering might. As for Han Li himself, he merely stood expressionlessly on the spot, manipulating his sword threads to hunt down his 3 opponents. Right at this moment, a resounding boom suddenly erupted in the air above. Immediately thereafter, a vast expanse of white light appeared overhead, following which hundreds of pillars of white light came raining down from above. The operators of the remaining battle arc could see that the 3 spatial tempering stage beings had been forced firmly onto the back foot, and they were using the battle arc to provide them with some assistance. Han Li looked up at the oncoming pillars of light through narrowed eyes, and he made no effort to try and evade. Thus, his body was completely inundated by white light amid a rumbling boom. The azure threads that were hunting down the three spatial tempering stage beings seemed to have been impacted as a result, and they suddenly ceased in their pursuit. All three beings heaved a sigh of relief in unison, and only then did they stop in midair before hurriedly summoning a few treasures. The elderly woman raised a hand to release a shimmering golden piece of artwork, depicting an extremely complex golden formation. The midget opened his mouth to expel a green wooden bowl, and at the same time, a dozen or so yellow darts flew out of his hand before revolving around his body. Meanwhile, the pale-faced being rubbed his hands together, and a pair of glossy black bracers appeared on his forearms. Both of the bracers were covered in complex and intricate patterns, giving them quite a mysterious and intriguing appearance. Even after summoning their treasures, the three of them still wore tense expressions as they looked on at the vast expanse of white light in the distance. They were not naive enough to believe that Han Li would be killed so easily. All of a sudden, an ear-splitting boom erupted from within the white light, following which azure light flashed, and a massive bird erupted from within. In the beginning, the bird was only several tens of feet in size, but its body instantly swelled to around 700 to 800 feet in size amid a flash of spiritual light. The colossal bird flapped its wings and transformed into a gust of fierce winds that appeared above the elderly woman's head in the next instant. A rumbling thunderclap rang out as countless arcs of white lightning that were as thick as large bowls surfaced over the bird's body. Its gargantuan talons came crashing down amid the flashing lightning, and before they had even descended upon their target, a mountainous burst of spiritual pressure had already struck her. "Look out!" Both the pale-faced being and the midget were quite alarmed to see this. The pale-faced being lashed out from afar, and ghostly howls rang out from his bracers as two pillars of black light hurtled through the air. Meanwhile, the dozen or so yellow darts circling around the midget's body also shot forth as streaks of yellow light. Both of them were trying to stop Han Li in his tracks. At this point, they'd all realized that they'd severely underestimated Han Li's power, and that he was not an opponent any one of them could face on their own. Thus, they were absolutely petrified, and were doing everything they could to avoid being divided and conquered. As soon as the immense spiritual pressure emanating from Han Li's pair of massive talons dawned on the elderly woman, her face instantly turned deathly pale. The massive bird was flying toward her far too quickly for her to evade, and in her desperation, she could only grit her teeth before expelling a mouthful of blood essence onto the artwork before her. The ball of blood essence instantly exploded into a cloud of blood mist that was immediately absorbed by the artwork, and almost at the exact same moment, a ball of dazzling golden light erupted from the artwork, following which the golden formation inscribed upon it shot forth from within. The formation swelled to over 100 feet in size in a flash, then rose up rapidly into the air. The giant bird completely disregarded the oncoming pillars of black light and streaks of yellow light, clamping down with single-minded ferocity onto the golden formation with its huge talons. An explosive boom rang out as white arcs of lightning intertwined with golden light to conjure up a spectacular light show. The surrounding space exploded as a result of the clash, causing everything in the nearby area to twist and warp. The massive bird remained completely unscathed in spite of that explosion, but the elderly woman's face instantly paled as she let loose a pained groan within the golden formation, then threw up a mouthful of blood. Thankfully for her, the golden formation had managed to just barely keep the oncoming talons at bay. However, before she even had a chance to heave a sigh of relief, a cold light flashed through the giant bird's eyes, and it sent its other set of talons hurtling downward as well. The elderly woman's heart immediately sank upon seeing this. In the face of Han Li's devastating attack, she could only open her mouth and expel another mouthful of blood essence onto the golden formation up above. The formation expanded slightly in size as a result, and she could only hope that it would be powerful enough to withstand Han Li's attacks. She only had to keep him at bay for a short while before her companions would be able to swoop in and reinforce her. Despite how powerful Han Li was, there was still a good chance that the three of them would be able to kill him if they were to combine their powers. The woman had made the right decision under the current circumstances, but she had still underestimated the power of Han Li's cunning transformation. Among the 5 transformations of the 12 awakening transformations that Han Li had mastered, the Kun Peng transformation was the one he was most proficient in. Furthermore, he had also absorbed 4 other true spirit bloods that further enhanced his body, thereby significantly bolstering the power of Kun Peng transformation. In his current state, he was no less powerful than the spirit birds who had inherited the bloodline of the Kun Peng. Just as the giant bird's talons were about to strike the golden formation, a cold light flashed through its eyes, and it suddenly opened its mouth to unleash an extraordinarily thick bolt of lightning. The bolt of lightning struck the golden formation first, causing the latter to tremor violently. Right at this moment, the other set of talons also struck the formation amid an earth-shattering boom. The golden light emanating from the formation only flashed a few times before it was torn apart by the pair of giant talons, as if it were nothing more than a frail rag. The woman was petrified upon seeing this, yet before she had a chance to unleash any other abilities, one of the massive talons flashed through the air, instantly splitting her body into several sections, and her dismembered remains plummeted from the air above amid a rain of fresh blood. At this moment, the 2 pillars of black light and dozen or so yellow streaks of light were also about to strike the gigantic bird's body. However, spiritual light suddenly flashed as a crystalline light barrier surfaced from within the bird's body. The pillars and streaks of light faltered initially upon striking the light barrier, before being refracted in a completely different direction, thereby missing their target. 2 pillars of black light disappeared into the distance in a flash, but the streaks of yellow light twisted around before hurtling toward the giant bird again. However, the bird merely flapped its wings to sweep up a burst of fierce white winds, and the yellow streaks of light were blown into oblivion. Arcs of lightning then began to flash erratically all over the giant bird's body, and it pounced directly toward the midget amid a string of successive thunderclaps. After witnessing Han Li slay the elderly woman before swatting aside his attack with ease, the midget's face instantly turned deathly pale at the sight of the oncoming Han Li. He immediately stomped a foot down onto his silver cloud before flashing through the air as a ball of silver light. In the next instant, he appeared beside the paleface being before pointing a finger at the green wooden bowl beside him. The bowl immediately transformed into a green light barrier, then shielded his body within. Meanwhile, the paleface being wore a dark expression as he let loose a loud cry. Bursts of black mist immediately erupted from the bracers that he was wearing, and the black mist enshrouded both himself and the midget in the blink of an eye. Letter 1D627, letter 1D45F, letter 1D452, letter 1D452, letter 1D638, letter 1D626, letter 1D624, letter 1D630, letter 1D4C2. The black mist then began to surge in all directions, quickly covering an area with a radius of over 300 feet and continuing to expand outward, showing no signs of stopping. A series of ghostly shadows appeared within the mist amid ghastly howls and unsettling cries. Both the pale-faced being and the midget's auras disappeared within the mist. At this moment, the giant bird had also changed directions to pursue the midget, and it was greeted by the sight of a sea of black mist. Yin Qi. He almost immediately identified this black mist to be extremely pure Yin Qi. If a normal cultivator were to be caught off guard and ventured into the mist, they would be instantly reduced to a shriveled corpse. However, a peculiar look flashed through Han Li's eyes upon seeing this. Before the giant bird had even issued any instructions, the weeping soul beast suddenly let loose a cry of excitement. It then thumped its fists into its chest before letting loose a cold harumph, expelling a vast expanse of yellow light from its nostrils toward the black mist. The massive bird also let loose a clear cry, and it flapped its wings as the arcs of lightning surging all over its body exploded in unison, transforming into a dazzling ball of lightning. After the lightning disappeared, a loud thunderclap rang out, following which a bolt of white lightning as thick as a water tank emerged in the air above the sea of black mist. The giant bird emerged from within the bolt of lightning, then circled around in the air before swooping down toward the black mist down below. At this moment, the pale-faced being was lurking within the mist while holding a black flag in his hand, and as opposed to being enraged or alarmed by Han Li's actions, he was ecstatic. He let loose a loud cry before abruptly waving his flag through the air, upon which a vast expanse of black mist surged upward into the air to manifest a black ghostly face that was around an acre in size. The ghostly face was like a living being with green flames flashing in its eye sockets, and it opened its cavernous mouth as it rose up to meet the oncoming bird. However, right at this moment, the weeping soul beast's soul-devouring light swept forth. The ghostly face had only just risen slightly into the air when it let loose a howl of shock and horror as it became embroiled within the yellow light. The massive face twisted and warped before disintegrating into countless bursts of black chi that were swept up by the yellow light. Not only that, but the entire sea of black mist down below also began to churn violently in the instant that the yellow light appeared. As the yellow light passed through, the black mist was broken down into countless strands of black threads that then disappeared in a flash. In the past, the Weeping Soul Beast had been able to combat yin power, but it would have been quite difficult for it to absorb such a vast quantity of yin qi at once. However, following its many evolutions, its soul-devouring light had become far more powerful than it had been in the past. As such, most of the black mist was swept away in virtually the blink of an eye. Thus, the pale-faced being and the midget that were hiding within the mist were both completely revealed. The pale-faced being was holding a flag in his hand with an incredulous look on his face, and as soon as the two beings had been exposed, the giant bird lashed out toward them with its massive talons. Azure light flashed from the bird's wings, and it flapped them downward in unison. Nothing amiss seemed to have taken place as a result, but both the pale-faced being and the midget suddenly felt the air tighten around them, following which an invisible mountainous force crashed down on their shoulders. The pale-faced being possessed the superior cultivation base among the two, thereby allowing him to remain standing, albeit just barely, even in the face of such fearsome pressure. In contrast, his weaker companion let loose a muffled groan before being forced onto one knee. The azure light barrier around him became extremely warped, and a large section of it above his head had caved in significantly. At the same time, the barrier was shuddering violently, looking as if it could crumble at any moment. The midget was well aware of the immense defensive prowess that his treasure possessed, so he was extremely alarmed by this development. Despite how much their bodies were being debilitated by this immense pressure, they certainly weren't going to stand around idly and allow themselves to be killed. Thus, the pale-faced being forcibly flicked a wrist, and the black flag transformed into a black misty worm that rose up into the air. At the same time, black light swirled around his bracers, and a projection flew out from each bracer. And Lee focused his gaze to discover that this was a pair of malicious ghosts, one red and one green. Both had sinister sets of facial features with twin horns on their heads and bare upper bodies, wearing beast-eyed garments to conceal their lower bodies. The two ghosts raised their arms in unison, and a swath of black immediately surged forth, close behind the misty worm. Meanwhile, the midget laid a hand onto the top of his own head, and a small white jade sword flew out from within, then transforming into a streak of piercing light that hurtled toward the giant talons crashing down from above. In this dire situation, the two of them seemed to finally be fighting for their lives. A loud boom erupted up above again, and the silver battle arc suddenly unleashed countless pillars of light again, all of which hurtled directly toward the massive bird. However, the bird continued to swoop downward, but crystalline light flashed from its body in the process, forming a crystalline shield that flew out of its body. The shield was initially only around 10 feet in size, but in the instant that it was released, it swelled to become a giant shield that was over 200 feet in size, glittering under the sunlight in a dazzling display. All of the pillars of light that struck the giant shield were warped and refracted toward another direction, so none of the battle arc's attacks were able to land on Hanli. The white jade sword then crashed into the giant bird's talons amid a dull thump, only to be repelled with ease. The talons then closed around the sword like lightning, capturing it in an inescapable grasp that immobilized it no matter how much it struggled. The talons then clamped down with even greater force, and the flying sword was shattered into several segments amid a crisp crack. The midget down below immediately let loose a howl of anguish before throwing up several mouthfuls of blood in succession. Meanwhile, the giant talons continued downward and grabbed onto the azure light barrier, leaving the midget looking on with sheer horror in his eyes. However, the azure light barrier really was quite powerful. Even after the massive talons had closed around it, it managed to remain intact, even though it was creaking and groaning in an alarming manner. On the other side, the mist worm absorbed the vast expanse of black light into its body, and it suddenly seemed to have attained actual substance. Its previously misty and insubstantial body had grown a layer of glossy black scales, and it let loose a menacing roar as it violently whipped its tail into the massive bird's other set of talons. Despite the bird's enormous strength, its talons really were kept at bay by the black worm. A hint of surprise flashed through Han Li's eyes upon seeing this, but he then opened his cavernous beak, and a silver ball of flames suddenly shot forth from within. At the same time, the huge beak came pecking down with ferocious might. Immediately thereafter, The black worm was struck by the silver fireball and began to burn in an uncontrollable manner. The black worm's body then rapidly shrank, as if it were being devoured by the silver flames. At this moment, the gigantic bird's beak struck the azure light barrier with devastating power. The barrier was already on the brink of destruction, and it was shattered by the beak with ease. The midget within the shattered barrier no longer had the power to resist, and his body and soul were both crushed into a cloud of blood mist by the giant talons that instantly closed around him. Meanwhile, the pale-faced being was also in dire straits. After the black worm had been shrunk down to around a third of its original size, it was no longer able to withstand the massive bird's talons any longer, and was promptly destroyed. Immediately thereafter, the silver flames enveloped the massive talons before sweeping toward the pale-faced being. The pale-faced being's expression had already changed drastically after witnessing the death of his final companion, and a look of shock and horror finally appeared on his face after witnessing his own treasure failing to withstand his opponent's attacks. In his desperation, he gritted his teeth and let loose a long, shrill cry. An explosive boom rang out, following which a layer of crimson light surfaced over his body, then swelled to form a ball of light comparable in size to a wagon wheel. Even the giant talons that were enshrouded in silver flames were repelled by this ball of light, unable to land on their target. Taking advantage of this opportunity, a faint crimson shadow shot forth from within the crimson light, covering a distance of several hundred feet in a flash, then sped to over 1,000 feet away, taking it not too far away from the remaining battle arc. With Han Li's spirit eye ability, the crimson shadow naturally didn't escape his notice. As such, he immediately twisted around to give chase. However, right at this moment, a pillar of golden light suddenly shot forth soundlessly and without any premonition, almost instantly striking the crimson shadow that had just reappeared above the battle arc. Several arcs of golden lightning struck the crimson shadow amid a loud thunderclap, and the shadow let loose a blood-curdling cry before being reduced to nothingness. Divine Devilbane Lightning. Han Li was quite startled to see this familiar golden lightning. He cast his gaze toward the origin of the golden lightning to discover that the long-haired foreign being had already emerged from his golden ball, and that a blue humanoid puppet that was around 20 feet tall had appeared beside him. The puppet was entirely blue in color, and one of its hands was raised with thin arcs of lightning flashing in between its fingers. This Jia Tianmu had not only two high-grade puppets, but also a third one that was capable of unleashing divine Devilbane lightning. That came as quite a surprise to Han Li. However, he was only caught in a stunned stupor for an instant before flapping his wings and hurtling toward the silver battle arc as a gust of fierce winds. Azure light flashed, and his massive avian body swelled dramatically once again. Immediately thereafter, the massive bird's talons came crashing down upon the battle arc with piercing lightning flashing alongside them. The talons instantly pierced into the battle arc amid a string of resounding booms, and a massive hole was torn into its silver surface. The giant bird then opened its cavernous mouth, and a thick bolt of lightning blasted forth, disappearing into the hole in a flash. Lightning flashed, and cries of anguish rang out from within the battle arcs as countless Jiao Kai beings were slain in the blink of an eye. However, the giant bird didn't rest there. It flapped its wings downward in a violent manner, and a gust of fierce white wind swept forth. It then released the massive battle arcs, and the latter was swept up by the gale force winds before plummeting toward the ground. The battle arc crashed onto the ground amid a resounding boom, and the massive bird let loose a long cry before folding its wings away, then shrinking down to its humanoid form amid a flash of azure light. Han Li cast his gaze onto the ground down below, then made a hand seal, and several tens of small azure swords appeared in unison in the surrounding area. The swords tremored before hurtling through the as streaks of azure light, making short work of the ruined battle arc down below. Han Li then turned his attention to the battle arc that he had previously felled, manipulating his flying swords to destroy that arc as well. At this moment, the armored warriors and giant falcons in the surrounding area had also almost been completely eradicated by the Weeping Soul Beast and the leopard Kirin Beast. Only a few fortunate survivors had managed to flee into the extremely far distance, but the rest of their companions had all been slain. Han Li couldn't be bothered to send his two beasts after those beings, and he merely waved a hand through the air, upon which a black ring whizzed out of his sleeve. The massive black ape instantly shrank down and disappeared into the black ring as a streak of black light, along with the leopard Kirin beast, which also returned as a streak of golden light. Han Li swept a sleeve through the air, and the black ring flew back to him before being stowed away. Only then did Henli cast his gaze toward the distance where Jia Tianmu was standing, then suddenly flew over to him as a streak of azure light. After just a single flash, he appeared around 10 feet before Jia Tianmu in a wraith-like manner, then appraised him in a cold and expressionless manner. Jia Tianmu's heart stirred upon seeing this, but he quickly put on a smile before cupping his fist in a grateful salute. "Thank you for saving me, Senior. I'll be sure to fulfill my promise and reward you with a sentient puppet once we return to the myriad ancient race. You sure are brave to have dared to drag me into your mess. Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you right now?" A hint of killing intent surfaced within Han Li's narrowed eyes. "Surely you jest, fellow Taoist. If you had intended to do that, I'd already be dead. Besides, I only brought you into this matter as I had no alternatives, so I hope you'll forgive me, Senior," Jia Tianmu replied with a smile. "How did you know I was nearby? In my own opinion, my concealment techniques are quite effective, especially against those of a lower cultivation base than myself," Han Li suddenly asked after a brief silence. Following a brief hesitation, Jia Tianmu opened his mouth to expel an object, which landed in his hand before he offered it up for Han Li's inspection. "Of course I wouldn't have been able to detect your presence on my own. It was all thanks to this thing." Han Li focused his gaze on the item to find that it was a black and white bead with what appeared to be a series of spiritual chi vortexes swirling on its surface. "What's this?" Han Li found the item to be rather familiar somehow. "Are you unfamiliar with this item, Senior? This sense enhancement bead is a treasure refined from the inner core of a type of a rare spirit beast known as the Nai Beast. It can temporarily enhance one's spiritual sense by about twofold, but after every usage, there will be quite a few after effects, and the treasure will need to be nurtured within the user's body for many years before it recovers. However, it's extremely useful in dire situations," Jia Tianmu explained in a truthful manner. Spiritual sense enhancement by twofold. Han Li was stunned to hear this. If this treasure were able to enhance one's cultivation base by roughly twofold, then he wouldn't be all that surprised. After all, treasures that could be used to temporarily enhance one's power were rare in the spirit realm, but not non-existence. However, this was the first time he had heard of something that could enhance one's spiritual sense in the spirit realm. One's spiritual sense normally increased along with their cultivation base as well as the cultivation arts used, so generally speaking, no treasure could affect one's spiritual sense. Sense enhancement bead. "Nai Beast," Han Li murmured to himself as a peculiar look appeared in his eyes. Jia Tianmu's heart stirred at the sight of Han Li's expression, and he hurriedly added, "However, the Nai Beasts required to refine this bead are almost extinct in the spirit realm, and once a sense enhancement bead is used, it can't be used by any other person. If one were to forcibly devour a sense enhancement bead that had already previously been used by someone else, they would be driven insane due to their spiritual sense becoming overly chaotic." "I see." Han Li was rather disappointed to hear this, and the hint of killing intent that had just welled up in his heart quickly faded. However, he still found the black bead to be extremely familiar. In fact, there seemed to be one in his storage bracelet. Han Li suddenly recalled back to when he had slain that unknown beast in the Devil Fall Valley countless years ago. The inner core of that beast was very similar in appearance to this sense enhancement bead. Could it be that the mutant beast from back then was a Nai Beast? A hint of excitement welled up in Han Li's heart as that thought occurred to him. If he also possessed a sense enhancement bead, then wouldn't he be able to unleash close to twice as many gold-devouring beetles as he'd normally be capable of? In dire situations against overwhelmingly powerful enemies, he'd be able to scare them away with his gold-devouring beetles. Despite these thoughts running through his mind, Han Li didn't ask any further questions about the sense enhancement bead as he didn't want to arouse suspicion from Jia Tianmu. Instead, he glanced at the humanoid puppet beside them, then asked in an indifferent voice, "Judging from how intent the Jiaokai beings were on capturing, you must be no ordinary being, right? How about you introduce yourself first?" "I'm just an upper-race third-tier being who knows a thing or two about puppet refinement, which has earned me a bit of renown in my race," Jia Tianmu replied with a nonchalant smile. "Is that so? Your puppet refinement skills must truly be extraordinary for the Jiaokai race elders to hold you in such high regard," Han Li mused in an indifferent manner. Jia Tianmu merely chuckled and refrained from offering a response on this occasion. Instead, he surveyed the surrounding area before a slightly concerned look appeared on his face. "Senior, this is not a place that we should linger in. How about you leave with me first before we discuss any other matters?" "HMPH, you're right about that, but I have no intention of going with you. From now on we go our separate ways. You're such a big target, I don't want to get swept up in your mess a second time, Han Li harumphed coldly. He then twisted around, and azure light shimmered from his body as he prepared to depart. Wait, the further ahead you go, the more Jiaokai beings you'll encounter. Even with your powers, it won't be a simple task to escape from this area. I know of a secret teleportation formation that can take us directly out of the area that has been taken over by the Jiaokai race, Jia Tianmu hurriedly said with an urgent look on his face. A teleportation formation. You're not lying to me, are you? The azure light radiating from Han Li's body faded as he turned to Jia Tianmu with a surprised look on his face. Rest assured, Senior, this is a secret teleportation formation set up solely for special members of the 13 heavenly cloud races like myself. Once we get there, you'll be able to immediately ascertain the validity of my claim. If you discover that I'm lying, you can do with me as you please, Jia Tianmu replied with a smile. Han Li fell into silent contemplation upon hearing this. It was indeed the case that he'd encountered Jiao Kai race patrols with increased regularity along his journey. As such, he really was rather unconfident about his chances of being able to escape from this area. If he could use a teleportation formation that would take him away from here, then that would naturally be a very attractive option. He didn't have any ties with neither the 13 heavenly cloud races nor the Jiao Kai race, but the violence that the Jiao Kai race had displayed in slaughtering the entirety of Green Light City indicated to him that even if he were to surrender himself and offer up the Jade box, there was no way that they would spare him. In contrast, it seemed that the 13 heavenly cloud races weren't as oppressive toward outsiders, so it would be a good idea to travel to their territory, then slowly try and find a way back to his original continent. Furthermore, he was carrying 2 jade boxes that had to be taken care of, and this giant Tianmu seemed to be quite an important figure in the myriad ancient race, so perhaps he'd be able to help in that respect. After contemplating all these matters, Han Li nodded as his expression eased, and he said, "All right, in that case, I'll be happy to come along. Please lead the way, fellow Taoist Jia." Jia Tianmu was ecstatic to hear this, and he hurriedly expressed his gratitude to Han Li. The spiritual power within the few types of special spirit stones used in his puppets had been completely exhausted, so there was no way that a third-tier upper race being like him would be able to travel to the place where the teleportation formation was situated on his own. However, with Han Li's protection, he would have a far greater chance of getting to his destination without being captured or killed. Thus, Jia Tianmu immediately rose up into the air to recover the puppets that had been taken by the Jiao Kai beings, then stowed the humanoid puppet away before flying into the distance, leading the way for Han Li. 2 streaks of light, one golden and one azure, disappeared into the distance after just a few flashes. In the air above a massive city enshrouded under a yellow light barrier, there were over 100 silver battle arcs of different sizes. These battle's arcs ranged from just over 10,000 feet up to over 100,000 feet in size, and the largest of them were like small cities that hovered above the massive city. Within the largest of the battle arcs, there were a dozen or so spatial tempering stage Jiaokai beings, and they were standing inside the tallest pavilion on the arc while looking out at the city down below. On a chair behind them sat a pale-skinned young woman with a pair of purplish-golden eyes. This group of beings was currently conversing in hushed tones with one another while pointing down at the massive city. The young woman wore a contemplative expression, seemingly in deep thought about something. All of a sudden, spiritual light flashed from the entrance of the pavilion, following which a streak of red light shot forth toward the young woman. The woman raised an eyebrow as she waved a hand toward the streak of light, and it transformed into a ball of red flames that fell onto her palm. She carried the ball of flames in her hand before seeping her spiritual sense into it. After a short while, her expression darkened, and she said in a cold voice, "What a bunch of useless idiots." Everyone else's hearts stirred upon hearing this, and their conversation ceased as they turned their attention to her. "What's happened, Lady Yin?" a hunchbacked man asked in a careful manner. A group of 7th-tier and 8th-tier upper race beings were deployed to capture that Jia Tianmu, only to all be slain at the scene, and the other teleportation formation couldn't even be activated in the first place. The young woman harumphed coldly in response. "How is that possible? That Jia Tianmu is indeed proficient in puppet refinement, but he's just a mid-tier upper race being. How could he have killed all of the troops we sent after him?" Another long-faced woman asked in an incredulous manner. "According to the survivors, someone else was responsible for all this," the young woman replied with a shake of her head. "Someone else? Are there other holy race beings in the area aside from in this flowing water city?" the hunchbacked man exclaimed. "No, not a body integration stage being, but a 7th-tier upper race being instead. That's why I called them a bunch of useless idiots. How did so many of them lose to an opponent of the same cultivation base? The young woman's voice cooled even further as a hint of rage flashed through her eyes. None of the other beings dared to say anything after witnessing the young woman's fury. Send a message to Envoy 2 right away and inform them of the site of the incident. They'll be responsible for capturing Jiatianmu from now on. We'll focus all our efforts and attention on conquering Flowing Water City. The young woman's words were like cold, scathing blades. N2 has other missions to attend to. Surely he wouldn't be willing to come here, someone said in a careful manner. Just tell him that the one who saved Jiatianmu is the being that he wants to capture, and he'll have no choice but to take over this mission, the woman replied as she cast an indifferent glance toward the one who had just spoken. The one who saved Jiatianmu is the same being that Envoy 2 wants to capture. Everyone was quite startled to hear this. All right, that's enough of this matter. What we have to do now is conquer this city within the next 3 days. After that, Golden Armor City will be completely on its own, and it'll be as good as ours when that time comes. All of you just act according to the plan, the woman instructed. Yes, all of other high-grade Jiaokai beings replied with respectful bows. After that, they departed from the pavilion and flew back to the battle arcs that they were operating. 2 hours later, all of the battle arcs began to shimmer with spiritual light and emit bursts of ear-splitting rumbling, following an order from the young woman. Countless armored warriors, twin-headed giant falcons, and hundreds of winged worms surge out of the battle arcs, forming an orderly formation in the air, surrounding the entire giant city in a watertight manner. Following the emergence of this Jiao Kai race army, a series of puppets of different colors also flew out of the battle arcs. Most of these puppets were humanoid with the smallest comparable in size to a normal person, while the largest were over 100 feet tall each. There were only 3 beastly puppets among them, and each of them were over 1,000 feet in size. One of them had the appearance of a giant turtle but had 3 heads and a shell that was filled with thick and sharp spikes. Another one had the body of an ape and the head of a tiger with a pair of massive golden deer antlers. The third one was a flying ant-like puppet, and not only was it the largest of the 3, its body was entirely pristine white, as if it had been refined from crystal. Seeing as the Jiaokai beings were preparing to launch a large-scale attack, the entire city was cast into a frenzy. Through the massive light barrier, one could see that a series of formations had lit up across many locations within the city. Immediately thereafter, thick pillars of light rose up from the formations, injecting themselves into the light barrier in the air above. The light barrier instantly began to shimmer as a series of runes emerged from it, each of which was around 10 feet in size. At the same time, countless humanoid figures flew out of some of the buildings in the city, many of which immediately hurtled toward the formations that had just lit up. Attack! The young woman on the largest battle commanded, and the 3 largest beastly puppets led the charge. Spiritual light swirled around the giant turtle's shell, following which countless thick pillars of light instantly shot forth. Meanwhile, the tiger-headed ape beast opened its mouth to blast forth a golden pillar of light, within which the sounds of howling winds and explosive thunder could be heard. As for the giant crystalline ant, it also opened its mouth, but it expelled a vast expanse of dense green mist that swept through the air instead. Immediately thereafter, brilliant spiritual light radiated from the undersides of the battle arcs as pillars of light came raining down in a torrential downpour. All of a sudden, rumbling booms rang out incessantly like a relentless string of thunderclaps. Deep within the belly of a massive mountain, there was a dim hall in which everything was only barely visible. The entire area was deathly silent, and it seemed that no one had frequented this place for many years. However, a short while later, white light suddenly flashed within the hall, following which a formation that was several tens of feet in size appeared at the center of the hall. Spiritual light flashed amid a low buzzing sound, and 2 blurry humanoid figures emerged within the formation. One of them was a remarkably young man in a set of azure robes, while the other was a being with long disheveled hair that obscured half of his face. These 2 were none other than Han Li and Jia Tianmo. This place is extremely discreet and obscure, and this teleportation formation that was constructed here by our myriad ancient race cannot be used unless it's during a crisis. As the years have passed, fewer and fewer people know about it. Where we are now is already outside of the area taken over by the Jiao Kai race, and it's only several days of flight away from the 3rd largest city of our 13 heavenly cloud races, Cloud City, Jia Tianmu said with a smile. He then swept a hand through the air, casting an incantation seal onto a gem that was embedded onto a nearby wall. Spiritual light instantly flashed within the entire hall, as a dozen or so locations on the walls lit up in unison, illuminating the entire room. Han Li inspected his surroundings to find that this hall was only just over 1,000 feet in size, and it had been entirely paved with massive stones that were azure and white in color. It appeared to be quite ordinary and mundane, but the entire place was spotlessly clean. Thus, he nodded, and said in an indifferent manner, "It does indeed appear that it's been a very long time since someone has been here. By the way, this cloud city seems to be quite an important one to your 13 heavenly cloud races. I've heard that even the grand elder of your myriad ancient race has arrived there." "Oh, you're aware of this as well, fellow Taoist Han." He. Not only is Cloud City the third largest city in the 13 heavenly cloud races, it's also been constructed in a very unique manner, so it's quite a renowned city. It's also the closest major city to the army deployed by the Jiao Kai race, and when the true battle finally commences, Cloud City will be the place where all of the powerful beings of our 13 races will gather, Jia Tianmu explained with a smile. "That's good to hear. The city must be quite a big one for it to be so renowned. I just so happen to be looking for a large city so I can do some things," Han Li replied in an indifferent manner. "I have a temporary cave abode in Cloud City, so I'm technically half a landlord there. If you have something you need to do, just come and find me. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to help you with any overly important tasks, but I should be able to lend you a hand if you're just running a few errands here and there," Jia Tianmu offered. After witnessing Han Li slay several beings of the same cultivation base as himself so easily, Jia Tianmu had naturally already deduced that Han Li was no ordinary upper race being. As such, even though he had already escaped from the area under the control of the Jiao Kai race, he still wanted to try and befriend Han Li. "Thank you for your kind offer, fellow Taoist Jia. Perhaps I really will require your assistance with some matters." Han Li made no effort to turn down Jia Tianmu's proposal. Cloud City is currently in quite a sensitive state at the moment, so it won't be easy for beings outside of the 13 heavenly cloud races to enter the city. In particular, it'll be difficult to request entry for new faces like you. However, I've seen you slay several upper race Jiao Kai beings, so I can certainly vouch for you. But then again, things will obviously be made a lot easier if you join our myriad ancient race. How about you become a guest member of our race? I have some speaking rights in our myriad ancient race, and I can directly recommend you to our elders. With your powers, you'll definitely be held in high regard by our race. On top of that, the benefits you'll receive from becoming a guest member of our race are quite exorbitant. If you want to get something done in Cloud City, it'll be a lot easier for you as a guest member of the myriad ancient race," Jia Tianmu chuckled. "Thank you for the offer, Brother Jai, but I can't guarantee that I'll be staying in Cloud City for long, so I'll consider this matter another time," Han Li replied after a brief pause. "That's true. We should focus on getting to Cloud City first and consider these matters later. I have a few close friends in the city that I can introduce you to when we get there," Jia Tianmu said in a warm and inviting manner. Han Li nodded in response, but didn't say anything in reply. Thus, the two of them strode out of the teleportation formation and rushed toward the gates of the hall. After pushing open the gates, a blue stone passageway was revealed to them, and the passageway led upward in a winding manner. Han Li and Jia Tianmu instantly transformed into two streaks of light that disappeared into the passageway in a flash. Moments later, a ball of white light and a streak of azure light flew out of a large mountain, then hurtled into the distance. "This is Cloud City." Han Li hovered in midair as he looked up into the sky with a peculiar look on his face. Indeed, as the name suggests, Cloud City is one of two floating inhabitable lands in the spirit realm alongside Sky Island. It can't drift with the wind like Sky Island does, but it's able to adjust its own altitude as the seasons change during the year, Jia Tianmu introduced in a proud manner. At this moment, the two of them were situated on the summit of a small mountain, and several hundred kilometers in the air above them was a giant floating city. The city was hundreds of thousands of feet up in the air, and not only were there white clouds swirling all around it, the entirety of the island was constructed from some kind of unknown white material. For a city of such a massive size to be hovering so high up in the air was truly quite awe-inspiring to anyone witnessing such a spectacle for the first time. Another noteworthy feature is the dozen or so massive pristine white balls around the entire city. The balls didn't appear to be very large from afar, but if one were to draw closer, they'd discover that these were colossal objects that were over 100,000 feet in diameter. As for the exact number of these massive balls, that was something that Han Li couldn't yet ascertain, as he could only see one side of Cloud City. "What are those things?" Following his initial stunned stupor, Han Li pointed up at the massive balls up above with an expression of awe and curiosity on his face. Those are one of the city's defensive trump cards, and they were constructed by our myriad ancient race in conjunction with the stone cocoon race after much painstaking effort. You'll be able to learn the specific details about them once you ask around a little in Cloud City. For now, allow me to keep you in the dark. Jia Tianmu chuckled with a mysterious smile. Han Li was rather speechless upon hearing this. However, he had no intention of trying to force an answer out of Jia Tianmu. As such, he rose up into the air, flying toward Cloud City with a hint of curiosity in his heart. Jia Tianmu also followed close behind him as a streak of white light. From several hundred kilometers, one couldn't develop an accurate grasp of just how massive Cloud City was. However, after reaching within 50 kilometers of the city, even Han Li was flabbergasted by its gargantuan size despite his vast wealth of experience. At such close quarters, Cloud City seemed to have obscured most of the entire sky, and along the way they began to witness foreign beings flying through the air as streaks of light, or aboard carriages, arcs, and all types of flying treasures. As they approached the city, the number of foreign cultivators they encountered also steadily increased. When Han Li was close enough to catch a clear glimpse of the giant ball directly up ahead of him, the surrounding area was already filled with countless foreign beings traveling in all directions. For some reason, all of them skirted around the giant balls, resigning themselves to traveling a larger distance rather than passing by close to them. Han Li narrowed his eyes upon seeing this, and blue light flashed deep within his pupils, allowing him to inspect the giant balls in greater detail. The colossal balls seemed to have been constructed from the same material as Cloud City itself, but upon closer inspection, he discovered that there were faint cracks running all over the seemingly smooth surfaces of these balls. It was as if they were three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles that had been created using countless pieces of material fragments. Almost every single piece of materials had golden and silver runes shimmering on their surfaces, giving the balls an extremely mysterious appearance. Han Li's brows furrowed as he swept his spiritual sense toward the massive ball up ahead, only for it to be repelled by a powerful restrictive power as soon as it came into contact with the ball. Han Li didn't find this to be strange. Instead, he'd be quite surprised if he could glean the internal structure of such a mysterious object so easily. If you're carrying any metallic treasures or materials, make sure not to go within a 10,000 feet distance of those balls. Otherwise, everything of a metallic nature that you're carrying will be forcibly taken and devoured by those things. On top of that, Cloud City won't hand out any reparations for the losses incurred as a result of this, Jia Tianmu cautioned. Is that so? Han Li was quite surprised to hear this. He glanced at the beings around him who were cautiously avoiding the giant balls, and he was already almost fully convinced that Jia Tianmu was telling the truth. Shifting his gaze elsewhere, Han Li discovered that there were many beings flying toward a massive city gate of Cloud City. There were several tens of guards wearing the suits of armor at the city gate, and all of them were standing on either side of the gate with serious expressions on their faces, conducting examinations on all beings that intended to enter the city. These thorough examinations were only aimed at cultivators looking to enter the city, while those leaving the city were completely ignored. All of the guards were covered head to toe in suits of armor, but it was quite apparent that they were all of different shapes and sizes, and seemed to hail from different races. Han Li's eyes narrowed upon seeing this, but he continued onward, and after a short while he arrived at the city gate along with Jia Tianmu. There were a dozen or so other beings that also descended at this moment, and all of them seemed to be preparing to undergo examination. The so-called examination merely consisted of several guards holding strange-looking discs and scanning them over the unfamiliar faces that were trying to enter the city. At the same time, another being was holding another object, recording some things into that object while listening to the verdicts delivered by his companions. No light barriers or restrictions of that nature could be seen in the air above Cloud City. However, the sky was completely clear without anyone daring to try and fly over the city walls that were thousands of feet tall. On this occasion, Jia Tianmu didn't explain anything. Instead, he merely smiled and suddenly made his way directly toward the guards at the city gate. In the process, he was jumping the line, and all of the beings ahead of him were naturally quite displeased by his actions. However, most of these beings were only at the foundation establishment stage or core formation stage. Hence, All of them hurriedly put away their enraged expressions after discovering with their spiritual sense that Jia Tianmu was an upper race being. The beings in the line didn't dare to do anything, but that didn't apply to the guards at the city gates, and all of them immediately turned to Jia Tianmu with cold expressions on their faces. These guards all possessed comparable or even superior cultivation bases to Jia Tianmu, yet he remained completely unflustered as he swept a sleeve through the air. A palm-sized black badge instantly flew forth from within, heading directly toward one of the guards. The guard faltered initially upon seeing this, but he quickly recomposed himself before catching the badge and focusing his gaze on it. At the same time, Jia Tianmu's lips tremored slightly, and even though he wasn't saying anything, it was quite clear that he was using a voice transmission technique. The scenes that unfolded next left all of the beings in the line completely flabbergasted. After catching a clear glimpse of the badge in his hand, an astonished look appeared on the guard's face, and after hearing Jia Tianmu's voice transmission, he hurriedly stepped forward to return Jia Tianmu's badge to him with both hands. He then extended a respectful bow and said, "Greetings, Master Jia of the Myriad Ancient Race. Please come in. The elders of the Myriad Ancient Race have instructed us well in advance to take you to the Heavenly Dawn Pavilion to see them as soon as you arrive. Seeing as we can't eliminate the possibility that there could be Jiao Kai race spies in the city, we'll be sending a few guards to accompany you to the Heavenly Dawn Pavilion." "Oh, the elders are already in the Heavenly Dawn Pavilion. I was going to go and see them anyway. As for guards, don't worry about it. With fellow Taoist Han to accompany me, I'll be fine as long as I don't get attacked by body integration stage beings. Fellow Taoist Han isn't a heavenly cloud being, so prepare a free identity badge of the highest level for him. I can personally vouch for him," Jia Tianmu commanded as he accepted his badge from the guard. "Yes, Master Jia." The guard faltered slightly upon hearing this before immediately nodding in response. At this moment, Han Li also strode over in an unhurried manner. The guards instantly waved the discs in their hands toward him, and Han Li sensed a burst of extremely faint spiritual pressure erupt from the strange round discs. Immediately thereafter, several bursts of spiritual sense emanated from the guards' bodies before combining as one, then sweeping toward Han Li's body. A hint of surprise appeared in Han Li's eyes. This was the first time that he had seen a technique that allowed the spiritual sense of several people to be combined as one. As expected of one of the core cities of the 13 heavenly cloud races, even the guards at the city gates were capable of using such an incredible secret technique. After examining Han Li's cultivation base, all of the guards were filled with a sense of awe and veneration. 7th-tier upper race beings were quite rare, even among the 13 heavenly cloud races. The guards were all quite relieved after verifying that their discs hadn't detected any Jiao Kai race bloodline within Han Li's body, and one of them said, "Senior, seeing as Master Jiao is vouching for you and you've passed our preliminary examination, we'll be issuing you a high-grade identity badge right away. With this badge, you'll be able to go anywhere in Cloud City aside from a few secret and forbidden areas." "Thanks for your hard work," Han Li replied in a benevolent manner. The deity transformation stage guard waved his hands in response, and no longer mentioned anything about sending guards to accompany Jia Tianmu. It was quite clear that in his mind, a 7th-tier upper race being like Han Li was more than enough to ensure Jia Tianmu's safety. Moments later, the guards refined a Jade badge that contained some basic information about Han Li before handing it over to him. After that, the guards all stepped aside to open up a path between them, and Jia Tianmu strode into the city with Han Li following behind him in an unhurried manner. "Fellow Taoist Jia, what kind of secret technique did they use just then to combine their spiritual sense as one? Wouldn't such an extraordinary technique be extremely effective in battle?" Han Li suddenly asked after they'd entered the city. "That's the spirit condensing technique. It is indeed quite an extraordinary secret technique created by the Azure race, but a strict set of prerequisites must be satisfied before the technique can be cultivated. Not only do the cultivators involved have to be brothers related by blood, their cultivation arts and cultivation bases also have to be extremely closely matched before they can unleash this technique. In contrast with all of the other heavenly cloud races, most Azure beings are born as conjoined siblings, where it's quite common even for 6 or 7 siblings to be conjoined as a single being. However, after they grow up a little, they'll be able to split up, and Azure beings are stationed at all 4 city gates of Cloud City to conduct examinations on all those seeking to enter the city. After unleashing their spirit condensing technique, Even beings of a far superior cultivation base to theirs wouldn't be able to hide anything from them, Jia Tianmu explained with a smile. Han Li was a little disappointed to hear this, but he then decided that it certainly couldn't hurt to reference such an extraordinary technique as that could assist him in his own cultivation. With that in mind, he said, I see. Looks like my knowledge is rather lacking. I really am quite interested in that technique, though. Would you happen to know how to cultivate it, fellow Taoist Jia? The Azure race holds the spirit condensing technique in extremely high regard, so there won't be many copies of the cultivation method circulating outside their race. However, I should be able to find a way to get my hands on a copy. If you really want one, I'll get someone to secure a copy for you, Jia Tianmu replied. You have my thanks, fellow Taoist Jia, Hanley said with a smile as he cupped his fist in a salute. Haha, don't mention it. You saved my life, so this is the least I can do. I have to go and visit the elders of our myriad ancient race, so I won't be able to accompany you any longer. This is the location of my cave abode. You can come and visit in a few days for the sentient puppet I promised you earlier. Truth be told, I only have 2 or 3 puppets of such a high caliber in my cave abode, and I have to secure approval from the elders before I can give one away to an outsider. However, rest assured, I have some status in the myriad ancient race, so I'll definitely be granted approval with no issues, Jia Tianmu said with a smile as he handed over a stone tablet to Han Li. At this point, the two of them had already arrived in the city. Up ahead was a wide street that was lined with shops on both sides and filled with different types of beings. It wasn't exactly lively and bustling, but it certainly wasn't a ghost town either. Han Li accepted the stone tablet and inspected its contents in a cursory manner using spiritual sense, then smiled as he replied, All right, I also have some matters to take care of, so let's part ways here. Cloud City is not just inhabited by heavenly cloud beings, but also many foreign beings as well, some of whom have stayed here for thousands of years. As such, aside from some temporary dwellings, there are also cave abodes available to be rented. The rental fees are very high, but seeing as you're not planning to stay here for long anyway, those costs shouldn't be an issue to you. Also, make sure that you don't fight anyone or use your spiritual power in the city for no good reason. Otherwise, if you're caught doing so by the restrictions in the city, you'll be banished if you're lucky, and in worst-case scenarios, you could even have your cultivation base completely disabled. Even the elders of our 13 heavenly cloud races have to abide by this rule. All right, that's enough rambling from me. I'll be taking my leave now. After delivering some final words of caution, Jia Tianmu turned and departed. Han Li looked on as Jia Tianmu hailed a spirit carriage that was being drawn by a pair of deer-like spirit beasts, then got onto the carriage and traveled away. Only then did he withdraw his gaze before carefully appraising his surroundings. This place really did live up to its status as one of the major cities of the 13 heavenly cloud races. Not only were there countless buildings lining the streets here, all of them were of different styles, and there were virtually no 2 buildings that were exactly the same. Some of these buildings were mountainous structures over 1,000 feet tall, while others were only several tens of feet tall, yet all of them were extremely intricately crafted. Some of them were quite square and angular, resembling the pavilions often seen in the human race. Some were like giant trees that were shimmering with green light. It didn't take long for Han Li to become extremely intrigued by this city. As the name suggested, the 13 heavenly cloud races were comprised of 13 different races, yet ever since countless years ago, they'd lived together in harmony, advancing and coexisting as a single entity. If it weren't for the fact that they were objectively different beings with different bloodlines, they could almost be seen as one massive race. None of the 13 heavenly cloud races were anywhere near powerful enough to face a colossus like the Jiao Kai race on their own, but their combined powers were comparable with the top races of the spirit realm. This was why the 13 heavenly cloud races had managed to exist up to this point, despite their close proximity to the territory of the Jiao Kai race. In reality, battles would break out on the borders between the Jiao Kai race and the heavenly cloud races quite regularly. Either the Jiao Kai race took over some more of the heavenly cloud races' territory, or the latter recovered some of their lost land. Of course, under most circumstances, the Jiao Kai race still came out on top. However, the 13 heavenly cloud races were constantly backing up one another, so they hadn't suffered any decisive losses. As such, the heavenly cloud races weren't surprised by the sudden attack from the Jiao Kai race. Instead, they were able to react quickly and calmly, gathering up their powerful beings in preparation to deal their enemies a heavy retaliative blow. This information had all been disclosed whether intentionally or unintentionally by Jia Tianmu during their conversations on the way here. According to Jia Tianmu, the heavenly cloud races had quite a vast territory, and the Jiao Kai race wasn't the only powerful neighbor. There was also the night race, which was not inferior in power to the 13 heavenly cloud races, as well as the slightly weaker explosion race. Of course, there were also many small races in the nearby area, but the only way for them to survive was to join one of the more powerful races. Otherwise, they would either be completely wiped out or forced to find another home far away. This gave Han Li a general understanding of the situation surrounding the races in this area. At present, he was examining the streets in the city, while slowing, advancing, and contemplating about what he was going to do next. His target was undoubtedly to find a teleportation formation that could take him back to the Tianyuan continent. However, there was no way that a single being could own a teleportation formation of such a high caliber. Instead, it was most likely under the control of a certain major power. In that case, he had no choice but to liaise with the higher-ups of that major power if he wanted to use their teleportation formation. This was why he hadn't rejected Jia Tianmu's invitation to Cloud City. However, he was going to make up his mind about whether he was going to approach the higher-ups of the heavenly cloud races after he had gathered enough information. His top priority now was to find a place to stay in the city, then slowly search for some leads. Having made up his mind, Han Li no longer hesitated any further. He glanced at the shops around him, then picked one to visit that was similar in its design to a human pavilion. The shop wasn't very large and only had 2 levels. From the wares being sold on the shelves, it appeared that this was a very ordinary general store. The shopkeeper was a green-skinned being who was sitting on a chair behind the counter, and he immediately rose to his feet with a smile on his face at the sight of Han Li. "What can I help you with, Senior? We sell several types of specialty local products from Cloud City, as well as maps, general appliances." This foreign being appeared to be in his 40s, and even though he was only at the foundation establishment stage, he displayed no fear in the presence of Han Li. After extending a polite salute, he launched into a well-rehearsed spiel to advertise his wares. This wasn't particularly surprising. After all, at his lowly cultivation base, he most likely couldn't even tell the difference between a nascent soul and spatial tempering cultivator. Furthermore, there were countless beings who were far more powerful than him in Cloud City, so he was most likely already accustomed to being in the presence of beings that were unfathomably powerful to him. Han Li glanced at the shopkeeper before suddenly sweeping a sleeve through the air. A mid-grade spirit stone flew out from within as he said, "Get me the most detailed map of Cloud City you have. On top of that, I also have some things that I want to inquire about." The shopkeeper's smile immediately widened with elation as he caught the spirit stone, and he brought over a red stone tablet from one of the shelves in the shop as he said, "This is the best map in my store, and I'll be sure to answer your questions to the best of my abilities, Senior." A short while later, Han Li emerged from the shop with a calm expression on his face. He hailed a beast-drawn carriage on the street, then gave the driver an address before closing his eyes to meditate in the carriage. The driver immediately spurred on the beast-drawn carriage to rush down the street. 4 hours later, after passing through countless streets, the carriage finally carried Han Li to the nearest corner of the Cloud City and stopped in front of a strange, massive building. Han Li tossed a few spirit stones over to the driver before disembarking from the carriage and looking up at the building in a calm manner. This was a tall, hill-like building that had been entirely constructed from a yellow sand-like material. The building was over 10,000 feet, countless times taller than the other buildings nearby. Furthermore, there were several tens of rooms of different sizes littered all over the building, and the occasional being could be seen drifting in and out of the doors. This was like a giant wasp's net when appraised from afar. Han Li stood on the spot in a slight stupor for a long while, before finally casting his gaze downward at a large, wide-open entrance at the base of the building. There was a strange character inscribed on the wall on either side of the entrance, and even with the vast number of foreign languages that Han Li had mastered, he was completely unable to decipher what those characters meant. Following a brief hesitation, Han Li stroked his chin before striding toward the entrance. After making his way into the building, he found himself in an extraordinarily spacious hall. The hall was over 2,000 feet in size, and the walls and ground were all paved with beautiful green jade. There were also rows of flower pots that were several feet tall positioned along the walls, and within those pots were planted all types of vibrant spirit flowers and spirit herbs. At the center of the hall was a dilapidated black wooden table, on top of which was sprawled a man with snowy white hair and a set of long gray robes. The man was lying there in a completely motionless manner, seemingly in a deep slumber. Han Li made his way over to the table and said, "Find me one of your more secluded rooms. I want to stay here for a few days." Han Li's voice wasn't very loud, but it was like a loud thunderclap in the elderly man's ears, and he was instantly jerked awake. "Ah, welcome. I'll find a room for you right away, senior." The elderly man shuddered before sitting bolt upright, then hurriedly pulling out a shimmering white treasure that bore the appearance of an accounts book and quickly searching through it. Han Li's brows furrowed upon seeing this. This elderly man was a cultivator as well, so why he so unalert? It appeared that he wasn't pretending earlier and really had fallen asleep. Just as these thoughts were running through his mind, he cast a glance at the elderly man's face, upon which his expression changed drastically, and he exclaimed, Your senior martial brother Xiang, why are you here?" The sickly old man was none other than the Xianxia, who had entered the spatial node in the human world ahead of Han Li. His soul lamp had been snuffed out along with those of Old Devil Who, Eccentric Wind, and the others not long after they'd entered the spatial node, so he should be dead. That was why Han Li was so stunned to see him alive here. The elderly man abruptly faltered upon hearing Han Li's words, and only after a short while did he slowly raise his head to look up at Han Li. Letter 1D557, letter 1D563, letter 1D41E, letter 1D41E, letter 1D60, letter 1D41E. Letter 1D680, letter 1D560, letter 1D696. "Junior Marshal Brother Han, it really is you." The elderly man murmured with a peculiar expression that was caught somewhere between a smile and a grimace. "Yes, it's me. Why are your cultivation base and aura so?" Han Li swept his spiritual sense toward Xianxia, upon which a confused look appeared on his face. Xianxia had been a deity transformation cultivator even back in the human world, yet his cultivation base had since regressed to the core formation stage, and his aura was extremely feeble, as if his body had sustained severe damage. Xianxia stared blankly at Han Li for a long while before a thought suddenly seemed to have occurred to him, and he hurriedly rose to his feet as he said, "Junior Martial Brother, you also came to the spirit realm through a spatial node, right? You seem to have progressed significantly in your cultivation as well. This is not the place to talk. There won't be any customers anytime soon anyway, so come with me and we'll talk elsewhere." He then led Han Li toward a door situated on the side of the hall, and Han Li hesitated momentarily before following along. After entering through the door, the two of them arrived in a long corridor, on either side of which a series of exotic plants were growing. Hu Qinglei didn't lead Han Li very far before pushing open a nearby stone door and inviting Han Li into the room. "Take a seat, Junior Martial Brother. Never would I have thought that I'd see you again in my life. In my current state, I'm almost too embarrassed to be in your presence." Xianxia chuckled with a wry smile as they both took a seat. His voice was very dejected and sullen, and he seemed to only be a shadow of his former self. "What happened to you in the spatial node all those years ago? Are the other two still alive?" Han Li asked. "Eccentric Wind and Old Devil Who both died. We were extremely unlucky and encountered multiple spatial storms along the way. On the last occasion, two spatial storms stacked on top of one another, and I was the only survivor among us three. However, I'd lost almost all of my cultivation base from unleashing too many secret techniques in quick succession in order to save myself. What little cultivation base I have now is a result of many years of arduous cultivation." Xianxia sighed in a resigned manner. "The spatial node was indeed an extremely perilous place, so the fact that you survived is very much a silver lining on an otherwise dark cloud. However, the soul lamp that you left in the human world had already snuffed out. And why are you here on the Thunder Continent as opposed to in human territory?" Han Li asked. "My soul lamp was most likely snuffed out due to the secret techniques I used to save myself. The aftereffects from using those secret techniques left me in such a terrible condition that I was as good as dead. As for why I'm here on this continent, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. I was able to barely survive the spatial storms that I encountered, but as soon as I emerged from the spatial node, I ended up here. If I hadn't been saved by someone, I wouldn't even be alive right now. From the sounds of it, you ended up in the human territory of the spirit realm after emerging from the spatial node. In that case, I can only assume that the spatial storms blew me completely off course." There was still a hint of lingering fear in Xianxia's eyes as he recalled his horrific experiences in the spatial node, even after so many years had passed. Han Li merely nodded, without giving a reply this time. "Why are you here doing this kind of job, Senior Martial Brother Xiang? Have you thought about returning to the human race?" Han Li asked with a serious expression. The owner of this inn is a stone cocoon being, and he's the one who saved my life. He's quite kind-hearted and also quite powerful. He also seems to have some status in the stone cocoon race, and I decided to look after his inn for him to repay him for his kindness, and also because I have nowhere else to go. As for returning to the human race, I'd already given up on that dream long ago. There is indeed a teleportation formation under the control of the 13 heavenly cloud races that could facilitate teleportation to other continents, but it's said that an enormous amount of spirit stones is required to activate the formation each time, and just that expenditure alone is enough to force a holy race being of all their wealth. Even if I were to return to the height of my powers, I'd still be far from entitled to use the formation. Besides, even if I were to teleport to the Tian Yuan continent, in my current state, there's no chance for me to pass through the primordial world to travel to human territory. On top of that, there's no chance for me to ever reach the spatial tempering stage, so I'm planning to spend the rest of my life here, Xianxia replied with a forlorn shake of his head. Han Li didn't know how to comfort him after hearing that. By the way, I haven't heard about your experiences yet. Even though I can't return to the human race, I still want to hear about how us humans are doing in the spirit realm. Can you tell me about that, Junior Marshal Brother Han? Xianxia asked. There's not much to show and tell in terms of my experiences. After reaching the deity transformation stage, I also traveled to the spatial node according to the coordinates you sent me, and I ventured into it along with the Ice Phoenix, who had also reached the deity transformation stage by then. I was quite lucky in that even though I also encountered spatial storms, I was able to emerge largely unscathed with the assistance of the Ice Phoenix's spatial abilities. As for the current situation that the human race is in, I can't say that we're thriving. At most, we're just barely able to get by. As for the specifics, Han Li gave a brief recount of his own experiences, but refrained from disclosing the fact that he'd also once completely lost his cultivation base. As for the matters surrounding the human race, there was nothing strictly confidential anyway, so Han Li was happy to disclose the current situation to Xianxia. So we have 3 territories and a large number of body integration cultivators among our ranks. In that case, I can breathe a sigh of relief. Xianxia listened intently to Han Li's story before heaving a long sigh. Han Li fell silent again for a short while before suddenly asking, "Is there really a super teleportation formation in the 13 heavenly cloud races? How did you hear about this, Senior Marshal Brother Xiang?" Do you intend to use the teleportation formation as well? It's not really a confidential matter. Not only is there one in the 13 heavenly cloud races, the Jiao Kai race and the Night race also have one each. Among the major races in this area, only the Explosion race is apparently yet to construct one. Teleportation formations capable of teleporting beings between continents are only accessible to beings at or above the body integration stage, and you're not a heavenly cloud being either, so it's going to be very difficult for you to secure approval to use the formation. Thankfully, the 13 heavenly cloud races aren't too xenophobic toward foreign beings, so you should just settle and cultivate here. You'll be able to keep me company then. You can consider returning to the human race after progressing to the body integration stage. By the way, what's your cultivation base at the moment? I can sense that you're far more powerful than you were back in the human world, but I'm unable to detect your exact cultivation base. Xianxia mused with a curious look on his face. I'll have to think about the teleportation formation later, but at present, I've fortunately been able to progress to the spatial tempering stage. Han Li made no effort to hide his cultivation base. The spatial tempering stage. You really have been progressing extremely quickly, Junior Marshal Brother Han. In that case, you no longer have to worry about the limitations of a lifespan. Xianxia sighed in an envious manner upon hearing this. Technically, I'm immortal, but with the major heavenly tribulation that strikes me one every 3,000 years, my worries are certainly far from over. Each successive heavenly tribulation will be fiercer than the previous one, and I'll eventually die anyway unless I can ascend to the true immortal realm, Han Li said with a faint smile. That's not the same thing. After reaching the spatial tempering stage, you'll have thousands of years between heavenly tribulations, so you'll be able to take your time in your cultivation. With your brilliant aptitude, who's to say you won't be able to ascend to the true immortal realm in the end? Xianxia chuckled with a shake of his head. Our human and demon races have had no lack of freakish prodigies, yet how many of them have managed to ascend to the true immortal realm in the end? I'm only focusing on taking my cultivation one step at a time, rather than looking ahead too far and being overly ambitious, Han Li said with a wry smile. Let's discuss this matter at another time. I have to look after the inn for now, and I'll come to your room tonight for a more in-depth chat. You wouldn't refuse to see me, would you, Junior Marshal Brother Han? Xianxia chuckled. Of course not. I've only just arrived in Cloud City, so I also have some things that I need to ask you about. Han Li nodded in response. Thus, Xianxia picked out a relatively secluded room for Han Li to stay in before returning to the hall. Han Li set up a restriction within the room, then sat down in a cross-legged manner and fell into deep thought. The fact that he'd encountered Xianxia here forced him to reconsider some things. That night, Xianxia showed up as promised and chatted with Han Li for the entire night. Han Li obtained a lot of information about Cloud City from Xianxia, and only after the sun had risen the next day did Xianxia finally take his leave. However, just as Han Li had accompanied him to the door, a thought seemed to have suddenly occurred to him, and he abruptly turned around as with a hesitant look on his face as he said, "Junior Marshal Brother Han, I won't ever be able to return to human territory, but that possibility is still alive for you. If there ever comes a day when you want to leave Cloud City and go somewhere far away, please come to visit me first. I have some things to give to you, as well as a request I'd like to make, but rest assured, you'll be able to complete my request with ease as long as you can make it back to the human race, and doing so will also be immensely beneficial to you." Han Li faltered slightly upon hearing this, and after a brief pause he asked, "Oh, can't you just tell me your request now? I really can't say for sure when I'd be looking to leave this city. If an emergency strikes, I may not be able to go and visit you before I leave. Truth be told, I can't disclose these matters to you right now, and it'll take me some time to prepare some things. It would be best if you could come and visit me before your departure. Otherwise, you and I will both regret it," Xianxia replied with a meaningful shake of his head. Letter 1D4F, letter 1D4FB, letter 1D4E, letter 1D65A, letter 1D66C, letter 1D4E, letter 1D48F, letter 1D484, letter 1D490, letter 1D4F6. Thus, Han Li promised that he would do his best to visit Xianxia prior to his departure, and only then did Xianxia nod before departing from the room. Han Li looked on as Xianxia left, and a peculiar look appeared on his face. All of a sudden, he made a grabbing motion toward the door of his room, and an immense force erupted forth, instantly shutting the door again. At the same time, white light flashed from the walls within the room as the restriction within was activated, encapsulating the entire room. Han Li then strode over to a corner of the room before sitting down in a cross-legged manner on the futon that had been prepared there. It was unclear exactly what he was thinking, but a faint smile had appeared on his face while a cold light flashed through his eyes. The next day, Han Li continued to meditate in his room, showing no intention of going anywhere. Only on the morning of the third day was the door of the room finally opened, and he emerged from within in an unhurried manner. However, instead of going downstairs to the hall to find Xianxia, he left the inn through the exit on this level before drifting lightly down onto the streets outside. Han Li seemed to have already decided where he wanted to go, and he casually hailed a beast-drawn carriage and gave the driver a destination before setting off. Through the window of the carriage, Han Li could see everything on the streets outside. His heart stirred slightly as he cast his gaze toward the massive balls outside the city walls. Following his lengthy conversation with Xianxia the night before, he had learned just what these massive balls were. It turned out that these were 13 super-massive puppets, each of which was comparable in power to an early body integration stage being. Each of the 13 heavenly cloud races controlled one puppet, and it was quite clear just from those fearsome puppets just how stalwart the defenses of Cloud City were. It was no wonder that this city was designated to be the central hub for the resistance against the Jiao Kai race. At the very least, it would almost be impossible to launch an effective sneak attack on this city. Han Li quickly withdrew his gaze from the balls in the distance before closing his eyes. The place that he was traveling to wasn't very far away, so the beast-drawn carriage arrived at his destination after only an hour or so. Han Li casually tossed a few spirit stones toward the driver before disembarking the carriage and surveying his surroundings. The street before him appeared to be quite mundane, but there were far more people here than even on the main streets. The shops on either side of the street weren't very large, but business seemed to be booming for them as many customers were regularly entering and exiting the shops. Han Li nodded as he cast his gaze toward the shop that stood right before him. He glanced up at the plaque hanging above the entrance, then immediately strode in an expressionless manner. The shop was several hundred feet in size, and it was filled with rows of shelves, upon which were placed all types of items such as stone tablets, jade plates, silver badges, and ancient tomes. However, all of those items had been concealed under a shimmering light barrier. This was a shop that specialized in selling tomes. According to Xianxia, these types of shops couldn't be more common in Cloud City, but the few renowned shops that Han Li was interested in were all gathered on this street. Now that he had arrived, it appeared that Xianxia's claims rang true. The shop wasn't very large, but it really did contain many tomes of all different types. There were a few other foreign beings who were also inspecting the wares being sold in the shop, and they were all core formation stage beings. All of these foreign beings seemed to be focused on their respective searches, and all of them failed to notice that an upper race being had just strode into the shop. As for the shopkeeper, she was a young female foreign being who appeared to be only around 17 or 18 years of age. However, her skin was as pristine and translucent as snow, and there was a pea-sized white crystal embedded on her glabella. Her beautiful eyes were also shimmering with wisdom that seemed to belie her youthful appearance. Han Li's heart stirred as he instantly identified this woman as a being of the crystal race. He had naturally done some research on the 13 heavenly cloud races, and he knew that the crystal race was one of them. However, this race was quite a peculiar one. Not only was its entire population pitifully small at only around just over 1 million, they were also predominantly weaker than beings of the other 12 races. In spite of that, all of them had extremely long lifespans that were 3 to 4 times that of a human. Furthermore, all of them were very beautiful and highly intelligent. Almost all crystal beings could reach a high level of proficiency in pill refinement, formation spells, or talisman crafting with ease. As such, the crystal race was always extremely welcomed, and even though they didn't have much interest in things like power struggles, they enjoyed quite a lofty rank among the 13 heavenly cloud races. The crystal being had also noticed Han Li, and as she cast her gaze toward him, a hint of surprise flashed through her eyes, as if she'd managed to glean his cultivation base. Thus, she immediately rose to her feet and strode over to him before extending a delicate curtsy. "Welcome to my humble shop, Upper Race Senior. Is there anything I can help you with?" The woman spoke in a refined manner, and there wasn't anything forced or over the top about her, yet she somehow exuded an air of grace and elegance. It appeared the rumors were true. The crystal race really was unlike any other race he'd seen before. Han Li clucked his tongue with wonder internally, but his expression remained unchanged as he replied, "No need. I'll have a look for myself first, and I'll inform you if I require any assistance." "Then feel free to browse our wares, Senior." The crystal woman nodded in a manner that was neither humble nor arrogant, then curtsied again before leaving Han Li to his own devices. However, her words had come as quite a shock to all of the other customers in the shop. All of them hurriedly turned toward Han Li with surprised expressions on their faces before drawing a sharp breath in unison. They were naturally unable to glean Han Li's exact cultivation base, but the fact that it was so unfathomable to them indicated that Han Li was countless times more powerful than them. Thus, all of them became rather uneasy, and some of them immediately departed while others quickly picked out a few tomes before also hurrying away. In the blink of an eye, Han Li and the crystal woman were the only two beings left in the shop. Han Li paid no heed to this recent development as he made his way over to a nearby shelf to inspect the tomes that had been placed there. From the surface, Han Li naturally couldn't really see anything. Thus, he swept his spiritual sense toward one of the stone tablets on the shelf, and that was when he discovered the function of the light barrier around the shop items. Through the use of his spiritual sense, he could only glean a short string of introductory information. When he tried to inspect more of the stone tablet's contents, he encountered a slight obstruction. Of course, with his immensely powerful spiritual sense, he could naturally force his way through the restriction with ease, but doing so would undoubtedly attract the attention of the shopkeeper, and no being of any status would be willing to embarrass themselves in such a farcical manner. Han Li glanced at a few of the tomes on the shelf before him and discovered that most of them only contained some general information about the 13 heavenly cloud races, so he naturally wasn't very interested in them. Thus, he made his way over to another shelf before inspecting the tomes on there with his spiritual sense again. On this occasion, he seemed to have found what he was looking for. A short while later, a hint of elation appeared on his face, and he waved a hand toward a blue jade plate to draw it into his grasp. He then continued to search through the shop, and in the blink of an eye, he'd gathered over 20 tomes. Only then did he make his way over the crystal woman with a pleased expression on his face, and he placed everything down onto the table before him as he asked, "How many spirit stones are you charging for all this?" The crystal woman looked at the pile of tomes that had been placed before her, and a hint of surprise appeared on her face. She then suddenly smiled and said something that came as quite a surprise to Han Li. "These tomes aren't worth that much. You can take them for free, senior." Han Li faltered initially upon hearing this before his expression darkened slightly, and he asked, "Are you afraid that I won't be able to afford them?" "That was never my intention, senior. What I'm saying is that I have something else that may be of interest to you, and if you're willing to take it, then I can give all of these tomes to you for free," the woman replied with a composed smile. "Oh, what is it that you want to show me?" Han Li asked as his expression eased slightly. "Please wait for a moment. The item in question is quite valuable, so I've stored it in the back room." The woman rose to her feet with a smile before making her way toward the rear of the store. Han Li merely waited in silence on the spot, and moments later, the woman emerged with a black metal box. There were 2 azure talismans plastered over the surface of the box in a crisscross formation, indicating that the box was housing something very important. "Please take a look at the item in the box, senior. I'm sure it'll be quite useful to you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought it out for your inspection," the woman said with a knowing smile.